Hello Internet, I'm Jackie Fox, and for the next few videos, we're going to be talking about the Ukraine-Russia conflict, as well as a number of other conflicts and how they relate to this, taking us on a trip around time, around history, and around the world itself, trying to decide how past events may influence this. I'm going to try to take the generally broadest perspective possible here, but also the broadest variety of perspectives. So no one should expect this to be particularly orthodox, and don't expect it to be particularly short either, because, oh boy, there's a lot to cover. And first, the obvious disclaimer that since certain parts of this are going to be referencing an ongoing humanitarian crisis in the world, and one that is sometimes developing very quickly, we're getting new updates all the time in our information about how things are going on the ground, and how different geopolitical powers are acting. In preparation for this series, I've watched footage of the Finnish president, the German diplomats. I've seen perspectives from all over the world. I've seen all sorts of stuff from Ukraine as well. And I want to say I've not been on social media for any of this. And with the exception of the YouTube community tab, looking at certain people who were rebroadcasting certain social media and on-the-ground news highlights from Ukraine, I really haven't throughout the whole process. So I haven't actually seen a lot of the fake news that people have made videos about. The video game footage being insinuated to be happening in Ukraine, those kinds of things. With the exception of the Ghost of Kyiv. That one is particularly popular across the board. And as it pertains to that, I don't really care that that's fake news. I mean, it's a cool story, and if that motivates you ultimately, maybe the Ghost of Kyiv should not go down in history for being much more than a meme. Because they don't exist, obviously. Anybody who knows about, like, ace pilots and that kind of thing, you know this just can't be real. But at the same time, it's probably incredibly motivating for certain people. And there's a long history of war memes and their use in times of crisis in the military. For example, there was the "Kill Where He Was Here" meme that spread all over the world even in the pre-internet age. Perhaps even being one of the first memes to reach a global spread. Because this is an ongoing crisis, we're going to be starting in the history. There's a lot of people who have talked about certain aspects of geopolitical history, kind of things like political power, soft power, hard power, proxy wars that we engage in, and why all of these things might affect this situation, or how they might provide illustrative parallels. My frustration in this is that history is complicated, and people often just reference a part or a statistic of a particular conflict, instead of studying how the entire conflict might be illustrative. That's more the perspective that I'm going to be taking during this series. There are a lot of long-running consequences of the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, for example, that are especially relevant now. Even beyond just the way people are talking about this, like, oh, the Soviet Union got their asses kicked in the Middle East over the course of a decade by Afghanistan. And yes, that is probably politically relevant, but it's also worth letting the story of that invasion play out. You know, how other countries are involved. And what are the lessons that Russia should have learned from this? What are the lessons that Americans should have learned from this? It's also worth talking as well, though, what lessons did the Afghan people learn from this? And where does that put them in the modern day? I think these are all incredibly relevant questions. And also, I guess it makes sense to get this out here first. I mean, I've made several videos already referencing manufactured consent before this. And I think that discussing one of those frameworks could be important in relation to this story. If you're on top of world news, especially if you're in my left-wing audience, I keep talking like I have right-wing viewers. I really have no idea. Let me know in the comments where you fall on the political spectrum and why you subscribed. But anyways, for my left-wing viewers, you've probably been hearing a lot about the American-backed Saudi genocide that's happening in Yemen right now. You may know that there's an estimated 13 million people in that country that are starving right now. And it seems like there's no side of the political or even mainstream media that platform the idea of supporting, say, Palestinians over Israel. Because for our government in general and our corporate structures, both parties have their alliances with Israel. We only see the fringes actually talk about what's happening to the Palestinian people. and the slow invasion that has been happening in Palestinian land for decades. It never really makes that many headlines here. In fact, it's more likely to make a headline that someone was willing to speak out about it. And for the most part, we certainly don't talk about Yemen either. And then in Afghanistan right now, one of the reasons I think it's important to ask how these geopolitical events got us to where Afghanistan is because the Afghan people are starving as well. In part because the Taliban don't strive to have good governing priorities, for one. They don't seem to be very concerned as much about human welfare and more typically Western liberal values, to say the least. And they're definitely not capital L liberal in political philosophy. It seems like this particular interpretation of Sharia law reigns with an iron fist there. And at the same time, when the US left Afghanistan, we took all the money from the Afghani government and we just left with it. And we're still holding it to this day. And that money is frozen in what's effectively a sanction against the Taliban. Which is kind of a weird place to be because I can't say for certain if you give them that money. And I think there should probably be preconditions on this as well. Like maybe give them half of it with the stipulation that they spend 80% of that feeding people. And then give them the rest if they do so. You know, I'm not really sure how much they would use to actually feed people if we didn't. Or to feed women. I don't know. I just don't understand what their priorities are. I do think we need to give them the money back in one way or another, though. And maybe preconditions are a good way to go to make sure this situation doesn't remain a humanitarian crisis. But one thing is for certain. As long as the US holds on to these funds, 0% of them, none of them, can be used to feed any civilians. That's for certain. And like how we're seeing people starving in Yemen right now, we're literally seeing people starve to death in Afghanistan. Like mothers, pregnant mothers, are starving to death. I mean, what can we say for their babies? They're being born premature and distinctly underweight because no one has the food to feed even a pregnant woman. That is the state of the country. And unless you listen to more left-wing media and analysts such as myself, or as opposed to the mainstream news, or maybe you listen to public broadcasting like PBS or Al Jazeera or NPR, maybe some of these sources discuss it. But really, you don't much hear about that. And for the most part, we've ignored the very real creeping invasion into Ukraine for the last 8 years now, with the exception of briefly caring about Crimea. But in the 8 years following that, we never really covered what happened in the Donbass. And when we did, we often referred to it more in the context of a civil war, or just kind of ignored that it was happening at all. And it's also worth noting that this would align us ultimately with the Russian propaganda about the matter, instead of seeing this as an attempt at a Russian-backed coup. So right now, after Vladimir Putin declared Donetsk and Luhansk independent of Ukraine, these two areas making up much of the Donbass, it's kind of weird, because he doesn't have any authority over Ukraine, for one. You know, it's like if he came to America and said, hey, California is now an independent state. Deal with it. But to tie this back to manufacturing consent, it's interesting how we seem to be worried about this all of a sudden. From the perspective of Chomsky, this might be because, in the eyes of the media, we have chosen to make Ukraine worthy victims. Which doesn't mean they did anything to deserve to be victims. But that as victims, they are worthy of our care and compassion, as opposed to unworthy victims, which do not warrant our attention, such as people starving in Afghanistan, people starving in Yemen, such as the people who are losing their ground day by day in Palestine. We ignore these because the media has determined that they are unworthy victims, that it's not worth it to care. And it's just so wild how abruptly everyone seemed to care. Everyone started to care that there was a humanitarian crisis in the making, when there are already active humanitarian crises going on. And in fact, this was an active humanitarian crisis before everyone and their mother decided to cover it on the news. Now, personally, as you can probably tell from the fact that I'm going to do at least this video, if not a series, on the kind of things that would lead to these sorts of humanitarian crises that we are seeing here, you can you should be able to tell that I think that all of the victims of these war crimes are worthy of our care and compassion, including the people of Ukraine, but not simply just Ukraine. So if you're one of the people who is asking yourself why all of a sudden the media thinks that we need to take this humanitarian crisis very seriously, you could say, and from the authors that I've read defending this in the mainstream media, there's this kind of narrative that seems to hinge upon a single word: European. Which has to be some sort of a small comfort to Ukrainians. But it also shows how shallow their designation as a worthy victim is. Because the Ukrainian people didn't necessarily think of themselves as a European country until relatively recently. And I'll be damned if the rest of the world has acknowledged it. Are they in the EU? Are they in NATO? No. For the most part, we don't think of them as a European country. We don't necessarily think of them as a Soviet country either. We think of them as being Ukraine. More importantly, the media and our political leaders often just don't think of them at all. So it's kind of weird that all of a sudden all of these reporters are saying that Ukraine is a European country. Because until this invasion happened, it felt like the world and the media were kind of uncertain as to whether they wanted to call Ukrainians European. And yes, I'm talking about the reaction largely in European countries. That's largely what I've looked at in addition to America. And one thing that all of these countries have in common with Ukraine is that they're predominantly white. And conversely, of all our unworthy victims, including groups like the Islamic Uyghurs in China, what they all have in common is their brown skin. It's not so much that I think that this is really the reason, though I do think that our general pattern of behavior does support at least discussing this perspective, because I can see how it looks that way. And there probably is something to that. But you could also say that the reason why we had such a uniform and different reaction to this is because it's such an obnoxious and clearly unjustified act of aggression. I feel like even though it's one of the most propagandized countries in the world, I think even most Russians realize, and have realized from really early on, that this war is unjustified by anything that Putin has said. And we'll be talking about all the things that he said in his speech to attempt to justify this invasion further out in this series. I think the most important thing here is that the crisis can be leveraged against a long-standing geopolitical competitor, Russia. For most of the West, it seems like we've all wanted a reason to make them our official enemy for a long time. Just look what we did with Russiagate, for fuck's sake. And I mean, there was smoke there. There just wasn't the fire that we reported. I covered the smoke myself, and on that note, there is an element of the Mueller report that I do want to bring into this, actually. I haven't heard anyone else talk about it, and while there's an interesting parallel to be found there, before we get into all of that, and as a way of getting into all of that, let's talk about the history. Talking about Ukrainian history and their progress towards independence, you could really choose any point in time. Because it's not like they haven't been living on this land for centuries. But Ukraine got its name alongside its statehood under the Soviet Union in the early 1900s. The Russian Revolution of 1917 led to the founding of the Soviet Union under the Bolsheviks, and a subsequent civil war in Russia. A Ukrainian national movement for self-determination emerged in this time, under socialist influences. Several Ukrainian states briefly emerged. The internationally recognized Ukraine People's Republic, the predecessor to the modern Ukraine, was declared on June 23rd of 1917 by the First Universal of the Ukrainian Central Council, proclaimed at first as a part of the Russian Republic. After the October Revolution, the independence of the Ukrainian People's Republic was proclaimed on January 22nd, 1918, by the Fourth Universal of the Ukrainian Central Council. Compared to the US or the EU, Ukraine had less independence as a state than a US state would, and considerably less than a member of the EU, which is unfederated. though the United States could probably have been a lot more like the Soviet Union in terms of federal-state power balance, if not for our history of a somewhat balanced federalist-anti-federalist philosophy throughout the formative history of our union. So this is where that story starts. It's also where Putin's pre-invasion speech starts. So I guess it makes sense to start here from a chronological perspective like I am in this series. But it also seems to set the floor for this assertion that giving these states even that level of independence was a mistake by the Soviet Union, at least from Putin's perspective. And basically it seems like the preferential placement in that speech, it seems like this might be the first step in an attempt to correct that mistake, as if history itself did not happen. And in terms of what he declared in that speech that he was going to do and what he actually did, there's a gulf wide enough to pass an entire Russian invasion through. Even Russian soldiers have begun to realize that this isn't what they were being told they were getting into, which, along with poor conditions for what they're being asked to do, has led to thankfully low morale among Russian soldiers who are now in Ukraine. That being said, they have plenty of soldiers, and the soldiers that are coming into this situation now perhaps have a better understanding of their actual missions on the ground. So they're less likely to be demoralized, the way the first to the front lines were. Though, even with a better understanding of the situation, there are still familial ties at play here, giving the dispute some of the dynamic of a civil war and a proxy war at the same time. Just imagine showing up to the front lines like, I think that's my cousin. I'm pretty sure I see them at family reunions. I'm not going to shoot them. They are not a soldier. This is a civilian. One of the reasons I find Ukrainian history so fascinating is Euromaidan, which is my favorite portion of this whole thing. And I fell in love with the country watching now President Zelensky on Servant of the People, which seems to be trending right now. I've been recommending it to you for years, but as an actor and now as a besieged president, I think he's doing a good job. Now, it is important to note that he had some issues after he was elected in terms of consolidation of presidential powers, some dark money connections, and in fact his popularity was starting to wane. However, his messaging changed. It became a lot more humble and down to earth and less like a typical Ukrainian politician around the time this invasion began. And I mean, for one, America is kind of, we're doing our political fanboy thing, which is kind of weird, where we just kind of lust after half-decent political leaders. Like, does anyone remember Cuomo-sexuals? And I mean, he's not even a half-decent political leader. We just freaked out over him for no reason in the middle of the pandemic. Like, while he was shielding companies from being sued for killing the elderly with COVID. We don't have the best taste, is what I'm getting at. But also, that while Zelensky may have had his issues in the middle of his presidency, he's doing a more amazing job here right now than I think anyone could have reasonably expected for him, or really any leader, to do. Again, he deserves praise for what he has done since the invasion started. And at first, as a president, I thought he was too good to be true. I thought he was acting, He is an actor by trade. I thought about Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump, and when I thought about him at first. But he's really shaping up, and more importantly, showing up, as the same kind of down-to-earth and proud Ukrainian president that he once played on TV. And I think that that's really playing to his strengths. Now, compare him to the corrupt Russian and oligarch-backed president that was overthrown by popular demand as a part of Euromaidan. In attempting to step away from the growing relationship with Europe and realigning Ukraine with Russia, he was standing in the way of a growing pro-European zeitgeist. During Euromaidan, many Ukrainians, especially those in the West, took to the streets to show their support for closer ties with Europe. Meanwhile, in the more predominantly Russian-speaking East, there were some who opposed the Euromaidan protests. instead supporting the Yanukovych government and their policy of restoration of ties to Russia. Over time, Euromaidan came to describe a wave of demonstrations and civil unrest in Ukraine, the scope of which evolved to include calls for the resignation of President Yanukovych and his government. Violence escalated in the middle of January 2014 when the government accepted new anti-protest laws. Anti-government demonstrators occupied buildings in the center of Kyiv, including the Justice Ministry building, and riots from February 18th to 20th left 98 people dead, with approximately 15,000 injured and 100 missing. On the 21st of February, President Yanukovych signed a compromise deal with opposition leaders that promised constitutional changes to restore certain powers to parliament and called for early elections to be held in December. Petro Poroshenko, running on a pro-EU platform, won this election with over 50% of the vote, therefore not requiring a runoff election. While this is common and expected in our electoral system, it's uncommon for a candidate to win in the first round of an election in Ukraine. It's also worth noting that Volodymyr Zelensky won in the first round with 74% of the vote, which is even more uncommon. Upon his election, Poroshenko announced that his immediate priorities would be to take action in the civil unrest in eastern Ukraine and to mend ties with the Russian Federation. In the following October 2014 parliament elections, Petro Poroshenko's bloc Solidarity won 132 of the 423 contested seats, giving his government even more consolidated power. With this, the people of Ukraine had seized back their future, and they'd used it to reach out to allies and comrades in Europe. One of the things that was most interesting about this protest, and one of the things that gets some of the more orthodox leftists mad, really gets their panties in a bunch, is that during this movement there were a lot of Lenin statues that were taken down by force. And they were all over the country. During the Soviet era, they put up a lot of statues. And this is in part because of a tendency towards a cult of personality within Soviet communist government. So this was a visible sign of the realignment in the streets and a powerful symbolic act by the movement in making their messages heard and seen. This was a very clear declaration that this might be our history, but these statues need not be our future. As an American living in the South, I found that relatable a number of times during the last decade, though admittedly there weren't any statues of Lenin in the southern US. Though this decision would be propagandized by Putin, used as a justification to invade both Crimea and the Donbass, it strikes me as the last gasp of a once great empire, watching its influence wane, its sphere of influence being pushed back to its own borders over the decades since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Let's bring a few other points of history into our discussion. So at the end of World War II, we began this nuclear escalation that basically redraws the whole world under new imperial lines. You'll have what I'll typically be referring to as the West or the Western Cold War Alliance, and then you have the Soviet Union being one of the players in what you could think of as the Eastern Alliance. I don't think that either side was particularly communist. Some efforts were made and some went wrong so much faster than others, and some much more fundamentally. But there are interesting lessons to be learned here. There are experiments that show attempts at communism, and they have their mistakes that we can learn from, which is in part why I approach my personal core political perspective on the world from more of an anarchistic view than necessarily a socialist or communist one. Because at least in practice, communist socialist principles, as we have seen them executed on a large scale, tend towards authoritarian regimes, and I'm just not a fan of that. I think it has its benefits, but also definitely its detriments. Feels a bit like throwing the baby out with the bathwater, even though there are some things that these type of countries, especially China, as a particularly interesting example, even though it's not a country that I think is necessarily going in the right direction, but they have showed some interesting capabilities from the fact that they're a state-planned economy, and one that survived the Cold War as well. And that organizing your country this way is showing some interesting benefits in the face of large-scale problems that the West should be envious of. It's not perfect, and obviously what they're doing is still very capitalist, but I have digressed for too long. We redefined the world within these imperialist lines of thought and established a new series of proxy groups. And from these, we really have to talk about the formation of NATO. Now, NATO, the North Atlantic Trade Organization, is nominally a trade organization. I mean, it's in the fucking name. Couldn't be much clearer about that, except that it never really was intended to be this. And you can tell from the way that we're talking about it in the context of Ukraine. Like, when have you heard NATO referenced in the context of trade in the last year? No. It's also a defensive military alliance designed to stop the Eastern Alliance from taking any more ground. This brings us to what the Cold War really was, and why there weren't necessarily heroes on either side. It was two empires fighting for the control of the world. But because NATO, and because of nuclear weapons, this played out in a way that I think many people are forgetting right now. Or perhaps that many in generations like the millennials and younger never really lived with the threat of the Cold War in their adult lives in a meaningful way. Right now, a lot of people are reminding us of this. And I think it's an important point worth repeating that nuclear war is still a serious existential threat to mankind. Due to this, the Cold War had a very different flavor, and that stems from this collective agreement that we don't want to push this imperial pissing match to extinction, or trigger that series of events. So because of that, direct military confrontations between different groups of countries, especially NATO, we're basically dancing around NATO because this alliance was so effective, that NATO nations couldn't get involved in the conflict directly against nations like Russia, because if any one of them were to do so, it would draw them all into the conflict, and suddenly you have the potential for worldwide extinction. This way of thinking leads into the nature of the Cold War itself, a binary conflict in nature that played out predominantly through proxy wars in states less central to the conflict, and often by nature not as directly connected to the two empires that were fighting it out here, using the more neutral citizens of the world and their countries as our human shields, while committing horrendous war crimes on both sides, leading to numerous series of escalations that could have easily led to our extinction had one thing played out differently. And while we're traipsing through time, there is an important proxy battle that was fought that I think really bears discussion in relation to this, and that is the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. This isn't so much a story about Russia, though. It's a part of Afghani history that's still playing out today, even though it started in the 1970s. In 1973, an Afghan coup d'etat was led by Army General and Prince Mohammed Daoud Khan against his cousin, King Mohammed Zahir Shah. This happened on July 17th and resulted in the establishment of the Republic of Afghanistan under a one-party system led by Daoud. For this coup, Daoud led forces in Kabul along then Chief of Staff General Abdul Karim to overthrow the monarchy while the king was abroad in Italy. King Zahir Shah decided not to retaliate, and he formally abdicated the throne on August 24th, remaining in Italy in exile, ending more than 2 centuries of royal rule. At the time, this was described by staff in the United States National Security Council as a well-planned and swiftly executed coup. In 1978, the Communist People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan seized power in what was called the April Coup, or the Tsar Revolution, against then-President Khan. The PDPA declared the establishment of the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, with its first leader being named as People's Democratic Party General Secretary Nur Muhammad Taraki. The coup marked the end of the power of the Barakzai dynasty after 152 years. The revolution was initially welcomed by people in Kabul who had been dissatisfied with the Daoud government. This revolution was ordered by the PDPA member Hafizullah Amin, who would become a significant figure in the revolutionary government. At a press conference in New York in June 1978, Amin claimed that the event was not a coup, but a revolution by the will of the people. The coup involved heavy fighting and resulted in as many as 2,000 deaths, both military and civilian. The Tsar Revolution was a significant event in Afghani history, marking the onset of 43 years of conflict in the country. At first, this new government took a more moderate approach. However, from late October, the PDPA launched drastic reforms that struck the socio-economic structure of rural Afghanistan, which at the time was mostly tribal. It prohibited usury, although it didn't have in place any alternative for peasants who relied on the traditional, if exploitative, credit system on the countryside. This led to an agricultural crisis and a fall in agricultural production. Land reform itself was criticized for confiscating land in a haphazard manner that enraged everyone, benefited no one, and reduced food production. And this has been claimed to be the first instance of organized nationwide repression in Afghanistan's modern history, which very well could be true given the nation's previous tribal nature. The PDPA was an advocate of equal rights for women, and quickly declared the equality of the sexes in Afghanistan. A major Marxist-Leninist leader and member of the Revolutionary Council wrote a famous editorial which declared, "Privileges which women, by right, must have are equal education, job security, health services, and free time to rear healthy generation for building the future of the economy. Educating in," and then went on to say that educating and enlightening women is now the subject of close government attention. The PDPA pushed hard for reform and was brutal in repression of the opposition, arresting many without charge. The regime alienated a wide variety of people, including tribal and clan leaders, Islamists, Maoists, Western-educated teachers, and traditional religious leaders. The first anti-government revolts began in Kunar province in October of 1978. It's also worth noting, and this was ultimately a tension that would be exploited by the CIA later, but a lot of people just weren't happy with the fact that this was a secular government, as they wanted a more traditional Islamic government. By September of 1979, PDPA General Secretary Taraki was assassinated. General Secretary Taraki, which again is like their president, was assassinated in an internal coup orchestrated by Amin, which is his second coup for those keeping track. And he then assumed control of the People's Democratic Party. Amin was known for his independent and nationalist inclinations, but was also seen by many as a ruthless leader. He has been accused of killing tens of thousands of Afghani citizens in national prisons, while cracking down on both opposition and the Parshamites. 27,000 politically motivated executions reportedly took place in a single prison. Afghans generally held Amin personally responsible for most of this repression, while the Soviet Union considered his government illegitimate, discredited, and doomed to collapse in a civil war. They were also displeased with Amin's coup of a government that they had formed a military treaty with under Taraki, and the Soviet army invaded the country in December of 1979, heading for Kabul, killing Amin just 3 days later. A Soviet-organized regime led by Babrak Karmal, but inclusive of both moderate and reformist factions within the country, filled the vacuum. Soviet troops in more substantial numbers were deployed to stabilize Afghanistan under Karmal, marking the beginning of the Soviet-Afghan War. The United States and Pakistan, along with smaller actors like Saudi Arabia and China, continued supporting the rebels, delivering billions of dollars in money and weapons. Lasting 9 years, the war caused the death of between 562,000 and 2 million Afghans, and displaced about 6 million people who subsequently fled Afghanistan, mainly to Pakistan and Iran. This was and is very typical of the US playbook. We saw that tension. We saw a chance to fight Russia in Afghanistan through a proxy. So starting with Jimmy Carter, we started funding a group called the Mujahideen, or essentially those who are engaged in jihad, through the CIA's Operation Cyclone. Yeah. Interesting to know that we did that, right? I mean, especially for people my age, who were born after the Soviet collapse, but before 9/11. So when I found this out, obviously, I was quite shocked. I was very much politically raised in a post-9/11 America, so my instinct when I hear those engaged in jihad is to think, Oh my God, death to America, right? Like, all the terrorism and stuff. Oh my God, worst people in the world. Obviously, the most violent extremists. Jihad. Because that was very much the tone politically that I was raised in. So it seems surreal to find out that only like 20 years prior, or even closer to 12 years prior to 9/11, we were funding those engaged in jihad, and that we paid them for nearly a decade. We funded them in 3 waves overseen by various US presidents throughout the 1980s, with our total aid package being valued at around $10 billion at the time, and in doing that, the groups of the Mujahideen expanded. Essentially, it went on a hiring spree, and I mean, holy shit, we were like the angel investors of the Afghan theocratic terrorist resistance. And we didn't care that these people had no interest in establishing a democracy. Although it's worth pointing out that the PDPA was only nominally democratic, it was just another one-party state, really. Their only goal here was to overthrow their own government in order to implement the authoritarian theocracy that we currently decry in the West. Like what we've been saying is humane and unconscionable for 2 decades are their practices, and we gave them the power to have that power of state. We delegitimized a state that cared about equality of the sexes, while that has been one of the biggest ways that we have discredited the kind of theocratic leadership that we ultimately propped up. And when we stopped funding them, a number of things happened. Several groups that were the most committed to overthrowing Middle Eastern governments and replacing them with this sort of strict theocracy formed a movement that would call itself the Taliban. And these were directly formed from the remnants of the Mujahideen. Those who didn't go to the Taliban, many of them were recruited by one of the other financiers. See, it wasn't just that they were getting this money from the government or from the US government. There were also financiers, wealthy financiers from Saudi Arabia, for example. And you may remember one of their names, Osama bin Laden. So Osama says, the US military isn't going to pay you to do jihad anymore. Why don't you come over to my side? I promise I'll make it worth your while. And with that, it would be about 3 years before Al-Qaeda would carry out its first anti-American imperialist terror attacks. And to a certain point, a lot of the connections and funding for Al-Qaeda came in through Saudi Arabia. Not necessarily from what it looks like, from what I can tell without being super politically versed in the religious tensions in that specific area, it seems like the Saudi government probably wasn't involved, but that doesn't mean that groups within the country weren't without official permission from the Saudi royal family. So in order to fight Russia now, you can look at this as a very similar case. From both perspectives, we have similar dynamics here in Ukraine. Essentially, we have Russia trying to come in and overthrow the government, and on the other side, we have NATO forces who can't engage with Russia directly, using all kinds of techniques to arm Ukrainian civilians over the last decade in order to create a proxy war scenario now. And this is also, they don't necessarily have to put their necks on the line. And this decade of lethal aid approved by Presidents Obama and Trump, although both of them allegedly used this aid as a political bargaining chip in one way or another, this era helped the US military-industrial complex by finding homes for a lot of their guns. And in America, we really care about this problem of having too many homeless guns. I'm not saying they weren't given to a good home. I'm just saying that these Javelin missiles we see being used to take out tanks are very expensive. Someone is profiting very heavily from the US sending Javelin missiles. And I'm critical of the military-industrial complex because I think most of the things that it involves itself in, like Yemen, are unjustified. Iraq, Afghanistan, there's plenty of examples of this. But this is what's justified, at least from the perspective of coming to Ukraine's defense. In summary, things have gone really badly for Afghanistan, and by extension the whole Middle East, because the radicals we funded in this proxy war spread and became one of the greatest threats to global peace in the 21st century. But what of the fallout for America? Clearly, our decisions through the CIA can easily be blamed for the rise of Taliban and subsequently ISIS, which formed almost exactly the same way under US funding before escaping our control. So, let's face it, that's a lot of blame. Think about how many countries ISIS expanded into, each one having a reason to distrust us, even when we're there saying we're trying to help. And this provided the motivations for attacks on America since. I'm not saying that things like 9/11 were justified. I'm not saying that retaliatory violence is ever really justified. I'm not saying that terrorism, invasion, or imperialism are ever really justified. But it's not complete insanity that they would target the US in particular. They didn't just pick a country out of a hat and say, okay, we're starting the jihad with the United States of America. So it is. It was, in many ways, that retaliation to the horrible imperial choices made during Operation Cyclone. We've talked about the American and Afghani fallout from the Soviet-Afghani war, but what happened to the Soviet Union, the other side? Well, 10 years of being bogged down and trying to take control of the Afghani government, they fought almost exactly the same imperial war that we've been fighting for the last 20 years in Afghanistan, only at twice the speed and around 4 times the casualties per year. And this was notoriously a clusterfuck for us, both in terms of perceived legitimacy of our government, trust in the government, military-industrial complex, etc. There's so many places in the world right now that have plenty of reason to view us as villains. And as we'll eventually talk about in this video, both Chinese and Russian propaganda take plenty of advantage of this. Western anti-United States, anti-imperialist propaganda seems to have a pretty big grain of truth to it sometimes. I mean, yes, it is being used as propaganda, but at the same time, if we didn't do this kind of shit, we wouldn't be making it so easy for them on messaging. They really would have to be making stuff up about us to make us look bad. And they don't really, and that's the sad part. This is part of what made Russian propaganda channels like Russia Today so odd. A lot of times they're mostly telling a truthful story, but in the most negative way they can, distorting the facts or omitting context wherever needed to make us into the typical scheming villain. Anyways, the Soviet Union was very spread thin by this. The 10-year engagement pretty much forced the economy to collapse, and a commonality that I've seen in Russian leadership over the last 100 years, and perhaps even longer, is that often in sort of pissing matches between imperialist forces, Russian leaders don't particularly seem to mind their economy going to such a place that their people are starving. It just doesn't necessarily seem to bother them. Maybe this can be seen a little bit more generously as a side effect of the harsh and cruel weather conditions and realities of living in the Russian lands. But you could also see it as pretty heartless, too. So the collapse of the Soviet Union went on for too long. When people started starving in the streets, it's probably a good time to, reduce the military budget, quit engaging in foreign wars. They could have peacefully withdrawn from the rest of the world and focused on keeping their citizens alive. Had their economy not collapsed, the Soviet Union might have made it through the 1980s, just like China. It could have happened. But in part, because of Afghanistan and its 10-year quagmire, they would never come close to winning. When the change of powers happened in Soviet Russia became just Russia, the Soviet Union of the Soviet state of Ukraine became Ukraine in 1991, officially declaring its independence. As all of this is happening, and as the starting point for this independence, all of the people are starving and desperately poor. And this is in part because of sanctions. This is in part because of military and because it seemed like the best way of winning the war smoothly, without a nuclear engagement, was to play economic uncle and keep raising the stakes in proxy wars and just shoveling excesses of money and weapons into both, while hitting them with sanctions, any opposition we could to overwhelm their economy. And then it worked. It took a long time, but it worked. And that doesn't mean that this strategy didn't have its own brand of civilian casualties. The strategy did help us avoid nuclear war, but it also created a large amount of human suffering in its own way. All of these new governments of Russia, Ukraine, all of them, they're all being formed in this new world of suffering. And what happened especially in Russia, I don't necessarily know whether or not this happened in Ukraine per se, but I assume similar things happen because you end up with a similar situation afterwards. But the Soviet Union distributed its ownership because this was the type of communism where the government owned everything, not the people. And they actually became communist for just a minute by literally giving the people the means of production through vouchers for a share of the state industry. Sounds great. But what happened? Well, it wasn't money, for one. Money was already massively devalued. And because of inflation, food is expensive. No one had the money to pay for it. So naturally, what most did with these vouchers was say, how can I trade this for money? How much money can I get? And that was the thing on the tips of every former Soviet's tongue as they started to be handed out. And the people who were just wealthy enough that they could still eat, they offered them pennies on the dollar, while they consolidated a massive amount of industrial power, especially in the energy sector. This formed the wealthy oligarchs that would eventually get into power, and this is largely because of the corrupt strings that allowed them to do such things as hold state auctions in which the doors were locked and only a single oligarch was allowed into the room. Only a single bid was ever taken. And with only that oligarch bidding on whatever was at bid, it suddenly became theirs at a rock-bottom price. And in the early history of independent Ukraine, it had a similar oligarchy-powered flavor, which was highly corrupt. And, to the detriment of Ukrainian people. It just was not a good start for independence. And the Ukrainian people fucking hate it. They hate it to this day. And what remnants of it remain and largely kept the status quo from 91 into the 20-teens was that these oligarchs, a lot like the Russian oligarchs, were aligned very closely with the Russian state. Therefore, this was kind of like a nominal independence. Many were beginning to feel like Ukraine was becoming that puppet state of Soviet powers once again. In 2004, Viktor Yanukovych, then prime minister, was declared the winner of the presidential elections, which the Supreme Court of Ukraine later ruled had been largely rigged. The results caused a public outcry in support of the opposition candidate Viktor Yushchenko, who challenged the outcome. During the tumultuous months of the Orange Revolution, candidate Yushchenko became gravely ill and was soon found by multiple independent physician groups to have been poisoned by dioxin. Yushchenko strongly suspected Russian involvement in his poisoning. All of this eventually resulted in the peaceful Orange Revolution, which brought Yushchenko and Yulia Tymoshenko to power, while casting Yanukovych in opposition. This is where Yanukovych's story makes a strange intersection with America by way of an Atwater-era Republican strategist named Paul Manafort. First officially started working with Yanukovych and his pro-Russian Party of Regions in 2006, acting as a political consultant helping to burnish the party's tarnished image after the Orange Revolution, for primary elections later in that year. Manafort molded Yanukovych and the other members of his party into a more presentable politicians, down to even advising them on their hair and clothes, according to a Washington Post report on Manafort's work in Ukraine. U.S. diplomats in the country sent a cable back to the State Department in 2006, observing that the Party of Regions was shifting from a haven for Donetsk mobsters and oligarchs into something more polished looking. With thanks to this assistance, Yanukovych returned to power in 2006 and was then re-elected in 2010. Manafort stuck with Yanukovych over the course of his tumultuous presidency, which included the jailing of his chief political rival, Yulia Tymoshenko, in 2011. Manafort, however, denied involvement in any of the actions taken during the revolution, such as the violent crackdown on protests. One of Manafort's firms also ran a lobbying effort in Washington to court better press coverage and more favorable public opinion for Yanukovych's administration during this time. But even after Yanukovych fled Ukraine following Euromaidan, Manafort continued to work as a political consultant for the party, helping it after it became the newly renamed Opposition Bloc in 2014 parliamentary elections. Over the course of Manafort's time in Ukraine, he allegedly made himself incredibly wealthy while flouting international tax and lobbying laws. Ukraine's Anti-Corruption Bureau found handwritten ledgers that showed $12.7 million in payments to Manafort from Yanukovych's Party of Regions from the period of 2007 to 2012. Manafort would then return to the US to provide similar services and expertise to the Trump campaign, although I feel like he didn't provide nearly as much advice on how Trump should wear his hair. Then again, his hair is pretty iconic. Anyways. What about all that ill-gotten money? Scrutiny brought against the Trump administration for corruption would see that all of the above crimes revealed when he was indicted in 2017, with charges claiming that Manafort had failed to disclose both his status as a foreign agent and his foreign bank accounts despite nearly a decade's worth of involvement in Ukrainian politics. Manafort was prosecuted in not one but two federal courts. In August 2018, he stood trial in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia and was convicted on 8 charges of tax and bank fraud. Manafort was next prosecuted on 10 other charges, but this effort ended a mistrial, with Manafort later admitting to his guilt. In the United States District Court for the District of Columbia, Manafort pled guilty to 2 charges of conspiracy to defraud the U.S. government and witness tampering, while agreeing to cooperate with prosecutors. Also, fun fact, the U.S. has frozen Yanukovych's U.S. assets by sanction and banned him from entering the country. Not like recently either, but enough about either of them. Let's talk about what took him down. The Maidan or Euromaidan protests started in November 2013 after President Yanukovych began moving away from an association agreement that had been in the works for the European Union, and instead chose to establish closer ties with the Russian Federation. However, members of parliament voted on the 22nd of February to remove the president and set an election for May 25th to select his replacement, a move described by Russia as a coup, and appears to be the reason that Vladimir Putin began preparations to annex Crimea later in the year. That March, Putin directed Russian troops and intelligence agents to disarm Ukrainian forces and take control of Crimea. Following the invasion and disarmament of Crimea, a controversial referendum was held in March of 2014, and the official result was that 97% wished to join with Russia, which is a suspiciously high number that has not been recognized by many international agencies at this point. However, I also haven't necessarily heard that this election was fraudulent quite in the same ways that the 2004 election of Yanukovych. Putin then annexed the country using the vote for legitimacy. In the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, armed men declaring themselves as local militia and supported by pro-Russian protesters seized government buildings, police stations in several cities, and held unrecognized status referendums similar to the ones being held in Crimea, but without the same overwhelming support for annexation that Crimea had shown. This insurgency was led by Russian emissaries Igor Girkin and Alexander Borodai, as well as militants from Russia, such as Arseny Pavlov. They proclaimed the self-styled Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic to have controlled about 1/3 of the oblasts in the last 8 years. Russian forces have fought as well as trained and supported these separatists, as they've held the same or similar front lines for the entirety of the engagement, which is equal parts civil war and proxy war. Ceasefires are agreed upon and violated predominantly by the Russian-backed separatists on a daily basis for years. These are the contested borderlands between Ukraine and Russia in the east, the same ones that were declared independent just before the beginning of the invasion. It was this particular invasion, which started in 2014, that Vladimir Putin declared victory in February of 2022, ordering military forces to enter the breakaway Ukrainian republics, calling this act a peacekeeping mission. He decided that he already had enough control of these two regions that he could declare them independent, even though it's not his country to be declaring things independent in. So there is an ignored 8-year invasion of Ukraine by Russia that happened all through the 2010s, and this was capped off with the declaration of independence of those two regions, following their cap. While our governments funded this proxy war, we heard little or nothing about it for 8 bloody years, until finally this disaster became far too big to ignore. And now the whole world has begun to pay attention. And finally, it's about fucking time. While we're paying attention, it's worth noting that a similar invasion to that first invasion in Ukraine is also currently happening in the former Soviet state of Georgia. Just worth mentioning, I don't know a ton about it, except that it's both less violent, but also more directly being done by the Russian military. And before we get off on this topic in this particular period of time, there's an interesting parallel between the things we discovered in the Mueller report and the first invasion, in that a big part of the Russian propaganda effort on both on its own citizens, as well as Ukrainian citizens, although it wasn't ever very successful in Ukraine on that front for the last 8 to 10 years. But largely what they've been trying to do is push and amplify actual organic separatist movements. And the funny thing is that they were literally doing the same thing here while they were doing this in Ukraine. And the evidence of this was detailed in the Mueller report. Particularly the ones that I remember the most, although there were other states that were mentioned in the report in relation to this. Russian state-aligned actors did things ranging from pumping Calexit and Texit hashtags to organizing distant events on Facebook. Like, they make the page, start the event, they get real-world Americans to show up to these kind of AstroTurf protests. I'll say that again, we have evidence that Russian actors used Facebook to set up real-world American protests. And I feel like these are pretty interesting because there were people who wondered why the organizers never showed up to these things, and always said, oh, I have to be out of town at that moment. So Russians were effectively getting real US people who had their own good faith reasons for supporting state-level succession, but amplifying their voices inorganically. And largely, this is the exact same playbook that they've been doing for the last decade in Donbass. Russian disinformation, Russia's relationship with the media, which I mentioned before, is truly fascinating and horrifying. It's really hard to say that Russian citizens trust any media within the country, because it's just the way that a sense of there's lies on both sides, which is probably very familiar to my American audience. And so much of it is state-controlled, though with the frequency of state agents making prominent positions on cable media, or even the cable media taking their story directly from the state account of things, you could say this is also familiar to us. But in Russia, there is controlled opposition as well to state media, and both of them lie. So it just makes it really impossible for Russians to feel like they can get truth within the mainstream media. But those who do follow a narrative, those who do think that there's something on Russian news that's worth believing, and follow this narrative that has been presented by Russia, that there are Nazi groups in the Donbass. And we'll talk about this claim in a bit as we're talking about justification. But they've also heard that there are huge Russian separatist protests, and that these displaced Russian citizens just want to be a part of Russia again. This is just the Crimean playbook all over again. Except that in this case, they could never get the votes required to legitimize their annexation efforts. So now that we have time to talk more about global context before getting into a discussion of how the war is going on the ground, that means it's time to really address the elephant in the room: NATO in the post-Cold War era. On one hand, there was absolutely a chance since the end of the Cold War, and an opportunity as well, to say, Everybody listen. Countries are massively impoverished and starving right now. And we're going to step in and be the bigger people here. And we could have stepped in and done everything that we could do to economically help the former Soviet states recover and build them into functioning states. We never did that, though. We never offered them aid until they were being invaded. We just let oligarchs take control of all of that power, to re-solidify it under fundamentally corrupt structures and monopolies. We thought that this would be better because it was capitalist now. And the damage that that allowed them to do. And not only that, but the ability to get away with it. That damage had in part been done by our inaction. We never allowed them, even the civilians, to shift in our minds from enemies to innocents, or even the victims of a part that we had played in a larger war. And this was doubly true of Russia and Russian citizens. It's like our empire needs a heel, a growing threat. And Russia was our easy enemy. It's not even hard to make us wary of Russia. Look at how many of us ate up Russiagate and really believed that Russia had interfered with our election in some meaningful way, other than driving divisive propaganda online on social media. I'm not saying that Russian propaganda on social media isn't a pretty big problem with a certain group of people who are definitely overly online, and especially those who already believe certain conspiracy theories, because then it's easier to kind of inject some of that flavor into your propaganda and get them to believe it because they already believe one of the things that you're saying. And unfortunately, this seems to be more and more apparent now when you look at what people really believe about the Russia-Ukraine crisis on the ground at places like the People's Convoy, which has been a right-wing copycat movement of the Freedom Convoy, which I discussed in an earlier video. I mean, maybe we just need this kind of bad guy to justify ballooning our military budgets, and we've certainly done that here. And this is in addition to doubling our aid to give Ukraine in a single year more than we gave the Mujahideen in the entirety of Afghanistan. Again, not saying that was a great decision when we did it then, just pointing out that we're giving like a decade's worth of military aid all at once. And that even though we're doing this, and even though we have committed from the beginning not to put boots on the ground or actually use our military, for some reason our military budget is also ballooning at the same time. So the idea of taking the former Soviet states into the fold and reducing the us versus them mentality that's been used as the core of our cultural differences for the last 70 years and used during that time to again and again militarize against an overseas threat. It just never seems to have occurred to the people in power that this was a feasible option. After many years of sanctions that pushed their economy to the breaking point, we do kind of owe them in a very similar way that we owe Afghanistan, though perhaps not quite as literally. There's a point in the 1990s where NATO could have been phased out, or at least the military aspect of NATO, as it was no longer necessary, in that the Cold War was over. The only reason to maintain the NATO military alliances is if you want to maintain the Cold War. And I can see some argument for that. As you know, Soviet Russia may not be a part of the Soviet Union anymore. They may have economically collapsed, sure. But Russia, at the same time, didn't sell its nukes and didn't get rid of them either. The logic here being that it's still a nuclear powerhouse. Therefore, we should keep NATO as a safeguard against their nuclear power so long as they remain one. But I think that's just a perspective that makes enemies. There are other nuclear-armed countries out there that we don't have a NATO alliance against to keep them in check, right? So why is it that Russia is the one country that we still, to this day, do not trust with nuclear weapons? And there was a point when Russia asked to join NATO. We could have accepted them, along with all the other former Soviet states. It's a lot harder to declare war on someone when you're under some of the same military and economic frameworks, because the risk of tearing those frameworks apart could be damaging enough to encourage you not to declare war on one of your fellow members. And could Russia object to the former Soviet states, such as Ukraine, Georgia, Finland, all of these states? Could Russia really object to them joining NATO? Would they have the same argument about NATO getting right up against their borders if they were a NATO country themselves? Wouldn't that diffuse these rhetorical bombs? Before this, I said that the Russian state justification is paper thin, and the NATO argument is a bit of it, so let me debunk that. NATO has an open policy that they will not allow a state to join NATO if they do not control the entirety of the lands within their borders. So, from the beginning of this, separatists, Russian-backed separatists, the invasion of Donbass, even the invasion of Crimea, which remains contested internationally, Ukraine has not been eligible to join NATO. Whether or not they wanted to join, whether or not other countries might have wanted them in, or whether or not someone was willing to send them an invitation, ultimately the results will always be the same. It just wasn't going to happen unless Putin and the separatists were both willing to relent, and maybe even have to give back Crimea. This, like the myriad of excuses Putin made for himself, is a falsehood, really only designed to make sense to people who exclusively follow Russian state propaganda. Nazis run Ukraine? No. NATO will let Ukraine join? No. The people have voted for independence. Nope, not even that. The only true part is this. Ukraine was given its independence from today's Russia all the way back in the 19-teens. So unless Putin has a time machine, there's not much he can do about that one either. And as for his prospects of taking them back by force, I'm not convinced. During the Cold War, there was a concept known as the Doomsday Clock. The Doomsday Clock is a symbol that represents the likelihood of a man-made global catastrophe. Maintained since 1947 by the members of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, the clock is a metaphor for threats to humanity from unchecked scientific and technical advances. The clock represents the hypothetical global catastrophe as midnight, and the Bulletin's opinion on how close the world is to a global catastrophe as a number of minutes or seconds to midnight, assessed in January of each year. The main factors influencing the clock are nuclear risk and climate change. The Bulletin Science and Security Board monitors new developments in the life sciences and technology that could inflict irrevocable harm to humanity. Midnight has a deeper meaning to it besides the constant threat of war. There are various things that are taken into consideration when scientists from the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists decide what midnight and global catastrophe really mean in a particular year. They might include politics, energy, weapons, diplomacy, and climate science as potential sources of threats, including nuclear threats, climate change, bioterrorism, and even artificial intelligence. The clock's original setting in 1947 was 7 minutes to midnight. It has been set backward and forward 24 times since, the farthest being 17 minutes from midnight in 1991, and the nearest being 100 seconds. That's 1 minute and 40 seconds from midnight, and that has been from 2020 to the present. The clock was moved 2.5 minutes in 2017, then forward to 2 minutes to midnight January of 2018, left unchanged in 2019. Then, in January of 2020, it was moved forward to 100 seconds before midnight. The clock setting has been left unchanged both in 2021 and 2022. Since 2010, the clock has been moved forward over 4 minutes, and has changed by 5 minutes and 20 seconds, even looking at its original setting in 1947. Due to multiple factors other than just nuclear annihilation, it's thought to represent in the public consciousness. This steady advance towards midnight could easily have as much or more to do with it the threat of global climate change than nuclear war. But it's interesting to note that in 1991, the year the final Soviet state, Ukraine, declared its independence, that's as close to safety as the world has ever been. Perhaps they too saw the means through which we might come to the end of an age of nuclear fears in that moment. And perhaps we have betrayed their hopes for the future in that moment as well, by maintaining a cold hostility towards Russia and a bitter indifference to the former Soviet states. I suppose only time will tell if we can ever make it back to 17 minutes to midnight again. Here's hoping. It would seem like a lot of people took this position before the conflict started, that there was absolutely no way Ukraine would be able to defend themselves against Russia. Most people have a mental framework of Russia being this massive country in the same way that China is, and that Ukraine is just some small stepping stone between Russia and the West. Ukraine is about the size of France, and many parts of it are much more densely populated than your average Russian city. Yes, Russia is a large country, don't get me wrong, even in terms of manpower. Even if we're not talking about equipment, the military advantage that Russia has is quite immense. However, the invasion is a lot more demanding than you might expect, and Ukraine was expected to be able to conscript a lot of citizens in the event of an invasion. In this respect, I think their success has exceeded many outside expectations as well. It's still by no means a fair or easy fight, but at the same time, this was never something that was a foregone conclusion that Ukraine could succeed here, especially with the amount of outside aid they were getting even before the February invasion happened. One of the many interesting ways that this is playing out that we haven't really seen so much in a war scenario before is this meme war that's going on across the internet, right? I really enjoyed the perspective of looking at this as a meme war, at least, because there's a lot of Russian propaganda, and it's 2022, and Ukraine is fighting the most propagandistic culture in the world, right up there with the US and China. Propaganda warfare is going to be one of the battlefields on which this war is fought, and the counter-propaganda here was really easy to make. You don't even have to write Ukrainian propaganda right now. You just have to show what's actually happening in the streets, because actually seeing what's happening has an incredible effect on the Russians and the Ukrainian people as well. It's like almost no matter what comes out of Ukraine, it's working to the Ukrainian advantage. The sad footage that you get out of this reinforces and breaks down the Russian narrative that they're not targeting civilians, when it's obvious that they are. I find it really interesting to know that, and I'm curious about how effective this will be as a counter to a lot of the Russian propaganda counter-narratives to the Russian citizens. When they're saying a lot of things right now, like, well, we're only bombing schools because, radical elements, they're using the schools to hide, right? And they're using these children as human shields. We had to bomb that school. It wasn't because we wanted to attack civilians. It wasn't because we were committing a terrorist act within this war, purely for political intimidation. It wasn't because we were committing war crimes against our brothers. No. But the reason that I don't think that this type of propaganda is necessarily going to fly within Russia is because this is a carbon copy of the US imperialist propaganda. It's a carbon copy of Israeli imperialist propaganda. This is exactly the type of narrative that the Russian state media is happy to call out. Maybe not so much in the case of Israel, but definitely in the case of the United States. So it's very likely that the Russian audience may already know that these talking points are lies, because they've already been told by their government, and they already have seen them in the context of Americans saying it over the last few years. And maybe they don't remember this? I don't know. Again, I'm really curious how effective this particular line of counter-propaganda will be, because if there's any people in the world that have been primed to recognize these talking points as absolute bullshit, it's got to be the Russian people. And I think this explains the massive protests that we're seeing, even growing within the Russian borders. You get a lot of sad footage that really encourages soldiers to question why they're in this war, that encourages Russian civilians to question Russian propaganda. But then there's also another category of true Ukrainian propaganda that is just, I've seen so many wild fucking videos. Like, did you see this $16 million tank getting towed by a Ukrainian farmer in his tractor? That was hilarious. I mean, you have these scenes like Tiananmen Square, where you see a column of Russian tanks coming through a Ukrainian city being stopped by thousands of protesters. And they're filming this because they know it's only going to go one of two ways. The story will either be that Russians are being completely shut down by this, or they aggress against these peaceful protesters defending their homeland. It's either going to be a sad story or a triumphant one, and neither makes Russian imperialism look particularly good or even competent. A lot of these soldiers, especially the first wave of soldiers, came in under this impression that they were coming to free the sovereign Russian citizens of the Donbass from an alleged Nazi occupation. Those were the marching orders when they first left and started their campaign for the actual invasion of Ukraine. These people are in the field every day, and these Russian soldiers are realizing that the reasons they were told they had to do this were absolute bullshit. One of the logistical issues is that there's a lot of Russian soldiers who haven't had cell phone service since they entered Ukraine. They don't have access to social media. They don't really have any way of gauging how this is going by use of the internet. So just imagine the surprise when a soldier, walking for hours from a truck out of gas or stuck in the mud, is met with a hostile Ukrainian greeting as he's forced to grovel for them for food and fuel. We've seen this as well in videos that have been majorly embarrassing to this big, tough Russian military. And this whole thing makes me wonder if Vladimir Putin said the Russian equivalent of "you will be greeted as liberators" to the soldiers who first entered Ukraine. Because as you hear about Russian soldiers early on going door to door in Ukrainian villages looking for fuel and food, finding only resistance, they're really acting as though they expect the Ukrainians to be grateful for their actions. And it's almost as if some of these people aren't fully aware that they are the invaders or aggressors in this situation because of how they've been propagandized prior to entering the country. In Ukraine right now, men are not being allowed to leave the country if they are of military age. They're being encouraged to arm themselves and defend their country, defend their cities. And a lot of people have done this. However, I don't necessarily feel good about them not letting some of their citizens out of their country when Russian forces have already been so willing to inflict civilian casualties. At the same time, the Russian army is mostly conscripts too, and we do still have some form of a draft here in the United States, even if we don't use it. So I can't be too mad at Ukraine for doing this, especially since this is probably the most logical and ethical time to do something like that. But at the same time, for the rest of the world, it's far easier to get them weapons and training than bodies on the ground. So the human capital of potential soldiers in Ukraine is incredibly important right now. So yes, it's not the greatest move, but I have been able to confirm that this is happening, and it is critically strategically important here. Now, Ukrainians are arming themselves and taking positions to defend their cities. They may be outnumbered overall, or before the invasion started, their trained military may have been outnumbered. But as long as there are enough bodies to carry them, it seems like every Western country is happy to send them a whole lot of arms. There's a big difference between arming civilians and actually having trained military, and Ukraine will always be outnumbered in this respect. But they might be able to give a similar number of boots on the ground ultimately, especially when you consider how slow and arduous the process has been for Russians to get their equipment inside of Ukrainian borders. It also means that at least in the near term, it's far more likely that Ukrainians will continue to outnumber Russians in most scenarios. That being said, even just saying this, Chernobyl and Kherson have both fallen to Russia already, just over a week into the conflict. Side note about Chernobyl, yes, the radiation levels have increased by a bit, but it's still a long ways lower than anything that anyone really needs to be concerned about. Unless you happen to be a soldier directly occupying that area, but even then it's not a huge concern. But at the same time, if it's a concern to anyone, it will be the people who are directly occupying that area who will be most affected by this. And just like many other elements of this story, one wrong shelling would rapidly change that scenario. But for now, there's not really a huge risk of radiation out of Chernobyl as things stand. Still, this is a fight 8 years in the making. Russia has been threatening these people for over a decade. even poisoning Russia's political competition in Ukraine in 2004. Many Ukrainians feel like Russia is long overdue some comeuppance, and they've been standing at the ready to give it to them. Russia made a mistake in not remembering the passion of the Orange Revolution or the Euromaidan, where protesters fought back against police who had been given orders to kill them by the Russian leadership. The time has come for them finally to stand up, like they did in 1991. And history finds that they are ready and waiting. Welcome to the video. I do want to point out that there is some Ukrainian propaganda that is not as truthful as the things I mentioned earlier, like the Ghost of Kiev. I'm not necessarily mad at that one because it seems more like a meme than an actual honest attempt at fake news. It's fake news that's become a meme, and I'm not particularly mad at it. Snake Island, the recording of them telling the Russian ship to fuck off, that was true enough. But within days we found out that these people didn't actually die, and that actually there were far more of them than was originally reported. But that's all relatively quaint compared to what was said at the Munich Security Council, and that we should unpack. Standing before the Munich Security Council in Germany, Volodymyr Zelensky, days before the invasion of his homeland, says in his speech that if Russia is allowed to take Ukraine, the border between Russia and Europe, that Europe will be next. It's a passionate speech. It's hard not to watch it and feel a sense of a call to action that Germany must have felt before signing an agreement to close the newly operational Nord Stream 2 if Russian troops step foot inside of Ukraine. The story he told was one of an imperial Russia, bent on taking back the Soviet states and powering through to become a threat to Europe. This is a good story if you need military aid. But to me, it seems utterly unrealistic, or at least anytime in the near future. There are a number of reasons for this, but chief among them is that Russia isn't prepared to get an easy victory in Ukraine by any means. Compared with the invasion of Afghanistan, in which the country's leader, Amin, was killed in only 3 days, it's been weeks at this point, and Zelensky is regularly posting touching and personal cell phone videos letting us know that he's alive and strong in spirit. In the long term for Russia, the invasion will be the easiest part. And spoiler alert, so far, Russians are really fucking it up, and far underperforming the Kremlin's goals for the operation. In their estimates, it seems that they expected that Kyiv would have fallen within the end of the second week. And yet, they still fight on in Mariupol, which is right across the Russian border. In part because it's the muddy season, in part because of aging military equipment and poor maintenance, but also in part because of a historical lack of infrastructure outside of the Russian capital that dates back into the Soviet era. To advance their forces across Russia, Putin relies on rail lines, and these rail lines currently end at the Ukrainian border, meaning that while it's not difficult to amass soldiers and equipment at the border, getting them into and across a contested battlefield is proving nearly impossible, made worse in part by the destruction of a few key pieces of Ukrainian infrastructure. Holding Ukraine will result in a large on-the-ground commitment of troops for the Russian military, as does Russia itself. So this alone stretches the Russian army quite thin. Even if they had the will to advance beyond Ukraine, it might take years. And even then, the infrastructure doesn't exist to move the Russian military through Ukraine in a timely manner. Russia may attempt to use the remains of their divided military at this point to, say, invade Georgia, where they already have a stronghold. But even this much expansion within the next decade would be incredibly risky for Putin. And even to say that is to say that pro-independence insurgencies won't be common even in 10 years, and this may not be the case. Now obviously this would be a rather bleak future for Ukraine, but it's far from the rapid expansion that Zelensky is suggesting here either. Russia is a powerful country still, but it's weaker than the former Soviet Union. And even the Soviet Union realized that actions such as those that Zelensky is proposing here would be their own suicide. Still, even in the realistic picture, this looks bad for Ukraine, even if Russian-European wars aren't likely a part of the picture even in the future. In a recent interview, Zelensky responded to concerns that a no-fly zone would be dangerous escalation. His response was to ask essentially, dangerous for me? No. Dangerous for them? Maybe. But what I know for certain is that without our skies being safe, many Ukrainian civilians would die. And he's not wrong. But I think this downplays just how bad nuclear war could be for the rest of the world. And he's right. We are hiding behind that excuse, as we largely did throughout the Cold War. But it wasn't unwise to act in such a way either. And that was a war we were able to win without making it a hot war. Though, for those who died in the numerous proxy wars, it felt hot enough. It's not just to say that not acting will have its own cost, and it's far more in the realm of certainty than simply risk. My fear is that there is still so much time to escalate this, and we have already escalated faster than I would have expected. It seems like every day we talk about a new sanction we could do, but think it might be too much. By the following day we've done it, and moved on to drumming up the next unthinkable thing that we might do. It's his duty to his people to drum up our sympathy. But we don't need anybody else helping us beat our own war drums, and we certainly need no exaggerations. In this plea, he claims that not instituting a no-fly zone would result in Ukraine losing millions of lives. This, like a Russian invasion of Europe, is unlikely. Looking at the much better armed Soviet Union in their 10-year engagement with the disorganized but well-armed and well-funded tribalist resistance, they inflicted between 500,000 and 2 million casualties in Afghanistan over the course of 10 years, while suffering 2,000 losses. Around two weeks in, Ukrainian sources estimate over 6,000 Russian soldiers have already died in this conflict, a number everyone is assuming to be inflated. But even if it's inflated by 3 times, that means that Russia has already lost as many soldiers here in 2 weeks than they did in the decade they fought the Mujahideen. Editor Jackie here, coming at you from the near future. I was looking back through this and fact-checking, and I noticed that, in fact, at 11 days into the struggle, Ukrainian estimates were around 11,000 Russian soldiers that had died, where in this I said it was 6,000. But furthermore, I looked into the figure of 11,000, and it looks like at that time there was some confirmation from folks inside of Russia that at least this number in Ukrainians' calculations of Russian losses was accurate. So, with this number in mind, and assuming that it is at least relatively accurate, we can take what I said previously, but the comparison now becomes that every 2 days, Russia is losing as many soldiers in this conflict as they did in the entire 10 years of the Russo-Afghani War. Even though Ukraine faces an uphill battle here, no matter what, it is really hard to overstate how poorly Russia is doing right now. And while this is still a long way from won, if it keeps going this way, it will be a massive and humiliating defeat for Russian forces. Compared to then, they face a modern military here, and a country full of volunteer soldiers ready to defend their homes. Civilian casualties here will be bad. It will be quite a long time, however, before they ever reach 1 million. And at the rate the Russians are losing money, equipment, and soldiers, I'm calling it now, they're never going to make it to 1 million without their entire military collapsing. Of course, it doesn't take anywhere near 1 million dead to make this a grave tragedy. However, it does matter that we calmly and clearly assess threats. Millions dead is perhaps worth risking nuclear retaliation, but is 100,000? Is 10,000? At some point we might be more willing to step in, but for right now, with the exception of nuclear retaliation and holding European fuel prices hostage, Putin doesn't seem to be much of a threat outside of the borders of Russia and Ukraine. This may change with time, but for now, despite Zelensky's rhetoric to the West, Putin isn't enough of a global threat to be worth risking an international nuclear war. At least, not yet. Of course, it's not just Ukraine that's seeking to elevate Putin's threat to the world. Conservative American Christian commentator Pat Robertson said that God is telling Putin to cut through Ukraine and cut through Europe, to declare war in Israel in order to bring about the end times, because, I guess Pat Robertson is getting closer to death, and he really wants to see the end of the times before he goes. He doesn't want to, die in vain. Look, I can't pretend to understand how this guy's brain is working, but maybe if you spend all your life believing the kind of crazy religious beliefs that Pat Robertson does, you start looking forward to the apocalypse. And I'm not picking on Christians there. This is a man who literally thinks that there are demons in clothes that you might buy from Goodwill. That kind of crazy. However, there is one form of desperately needed aid that is coming into Ukraine from across the world, and that's bodies. Inspired by Ukraine's story, or perhaps terrified of Zelensky's doomsday predictions, these potential foreign soldiers, horrified by on-the-ground reporting of the invasion that they've seen, are coming in from NATO countries and non-NATO countries alike, and most especially from former Soviet states, even including Russia's partner in this invasion, Belarus, and a not insignificant number of soldiers from Russia itself. But will this alone be enough? Like in the Cold War, for these NATO countries, the official involvement of their military in this conflict would draw basically the whole world into war. But what about other former Soviet nations, those who share a border with Russia, whom aren't a part of NATO? While I don't agree that NATO is a military threat to Europe in the near term, for a state like Georgia, I wouldn't be willing to make the same prediction. There is a real potential danger here for these states. Plus, it seems like to me that dropping a nuclear bomb on a country so close to your borders is a terrible idea. It seems like dropping a nuclear bomb on a country that you would want to invade and occupy is also a terrible idea. So I think that if there's one set of countries in the world who can actually skirt the world's fears of nuclear escalation and actually provide boots-on-the-ground military aid to Ukraine, I think it's these former Soviet states that aren't yet in NATO. As an update to this, by the way, it seems that Ukraine, Poland, and the UK have formed a trilateral agreement that will see them fighting this war on multiple fronts, although none of them are traditional military fronts because Poland and the UK are both NATO nations. This does mean that they will be coordinating on things like cyber defense. And this is kind of an interesting line to see being pushed by NATO nations. And at the time I started writing this, I didn't think that it was one that would be pushed. But at the same time, this isn't too far of an escalation from where we are at this point. From what we are already seeing from nations around the world. And it does bear saying, because I think that at some point in writing this, I will say that the news has been good in reporting this, but it has also more recently platformed a lot of people who want to escalate the conflict as well, in a lot of ways that we're talking about throughout this particular part of the video series. And it just seems to be the negative byproduct of this 24-hour news cycle, and the fact that the news wants to milk this like their new 9/11. So this goes from an issue that was completely ignored to something that has to fill the entirety of a 24-hour news cycle. And when you spend several days where there really isn't much to say about what's happening on the ground, because Russian troops have been stuck in formation in massive convoys for days, if not over a week at this point, then you have to start pushing at the fringes of what's the next boldest step we can take. And as you take those steps, as you push for those steps, within a week of this, all of a sudden, you're platforming people who want to take out heads of state and want to disguise fighter jets to shoot down Russian jets in the sky over Kyiv. When I started writing this, we were all still at a point of escalation, where we were talking about, sanctions that we've already done, like SWIFT, how that seemed way too extreme. And then they started platforming people who thought that SWIFT was the next thing they needed to do. And that pretty much covered all the sanctions that we were unwilling to do on day one that have already been put into effect now. And from that point on, it's gotten rapidly more militaristic since we seem to be out of sanctions. And it only seems to be getting worse by the day. You can hear the drumbeat building in this really uncomfortable way, because you don't manufacture consent overnight. But on the topic of non-NATO solidarity, we've already seen key officials from Belarus stepping down from their positions, and many in the Belarusian military being absolutely unwilling to cooperate with Russian invasion efforts. And maybe there's a bit of political calculus here going on with Russia that, since there's already Russian soldiers within their borders, they don't want to spread themselves too thin. But they're also another country in this, just as I mentioned before, that has an interest in Russia not advancing past Ukraine. I don't necessarily think that even if Russia were to send their troops into Ukraine to support the Ukrainian effort, I still don't think that Russia would invade Georgia in retaliation. I think that building this former Soviet solidarity would be pretty powerful, because if all of these states came together in their own sort of union, like an independent NATO, if they all grouped together in a way to say, well, if you attack any one of us, you attack all of us, that could work in holding back a country like modern-day Russia. Ukraine could take non-NATO states and create this sort of NATO analog. But this is a terrible time to do it, unfortunately. A lot of these states might also be seeing the writing on the wall and thinking, okay, if they succeed in Ukraine, it might not be a while before they invade my country. Now, I'm not saying that I don't think that ultimately Putin is thinking about taking more than one of these states back long term. But I don't think that logistically he can handle a second invasion while he's still engaging with Ukraine. His military already is having enough problems there, so imagine what would happen long term if they kept fighting this way without a massive bolster of impending reinforcements, which has always been the Russian government's ace in the hole in this situation. But at the same time, do I begrudge the people in Ukraine for pushing for a no-fly zone? For pushing to join NATO and the EU even now? For pushing to get us in on the ground? Or at least sending airplanes and drones? Do I blame them for that? No. I completely understand. If America was being invaded by someone like Russia and ignoring the NATO alliance and why this scenario probably isn't realistic, I would probably say the same things to the rest of the world that Volodymyr Zelensky is saying now, whether I thought they happened to be true or realistic or not. Fuck you and your thoughts and prayers, I might say. We are dying now. So I get where they're coming from. I get what they're saying. I get why they're making this kind of a maximalist case for this, even though I don't think that case is supported by evidence. But I also think it's important to say that it's not really supported by evidence, even if it is pro-Ukrainian propaganda. And one of the big things that we're going to have to talk about here is sanctions. We've talked a bit about sanctions already during this video. We talk about a lot of sanctions like a form of economic warfare, and in general, we think about economic sanctions. But sanctions that are intended to have broad and crippling effects on an economy are only one type of sanction. And they're also the one that is most damaging to innocent civilian populations. This is largely a class of sanctions that we'll be talking about in this video series. You can't starve a nation's economy without also, in some ways, starving its people. But there are a lot of tools in the sanctions toolbox. It's not entirely what we usually think about. Like when I was mentioning Afghanistan and the Taliban, seizing funds that are being held, or denying access to things that underpin whole economies, like banking systems and credit processing. Towards the beginning of this crisis, sanctions like these were considered to be more of a nuclear option. though that phrase has considerably less meaning in a context where one of the countries involved actually does have nukes. I'm just saying there's less civilian blowback from targeting companies and oligarchs specifically, instead of trying to aggressively rug pull the entire Russian economy overnight. I gotta say though, we really escalated the scope of our sanctions a bit quickly. At the same time, it didn't necessarily have huge immediate negative effects either for us or Russia, but there could be retaliation that comes once these sanctions starts to bite. And it's not like this wasn't something that we talked about the first days of this crisis. And in ways, it definitely escalated, and at least escalated our involvement in the situation. And that is absolutely one of the concerns with sanctions: retaliation and escalation. Putin is a proud leader, but he's very dependent on poll numbers, along with crushing his opposition to remain in power. This is already an incredibly unpopular war for him. And one thing I haven't heard anyone mention pertaining to it, that it might actually hurt his re-election chances for a fourth term in 2024. I mean, this is a little ways in the future, so maybe no one's thinking about that now. But it is also worth noting that Russia has a 2-term presidential term limit, which Putin personally bypassed in 2020 thanks to a constitutional reform that made it through just in time to see him elected for a 3rd term. In the eyes of Russian customs, he's already overstayed his welcome. With us pushing his economy to failure, we risk not only giving him a foreign scapegoat for the ills of the Russian economy, but also pushing him to make a big move that might help him recover his bravado in the polls. We can see it already. The longer this drags on, the more brutal and desperate his tactics become. He can feel his facade of a strong Russia beginning to crack like a paper tiger before the eyes of the people. I mention his pride because he's unlikely to back out without losing his political mandate to lead, or until there's a silver lining that he is likely to push his own people to the brink of starvation to achieve even a Pyrrhic victory. And until one of those things happen, he is very unlikely to admit defeat. He's very likely to only end this with negotiations that give him something of a win in return, something he can take back to the Russian people to bolster his chances of winning a 4th presidential term. I mean, I get why people don't talk about Russia in this way, because we think of Russia as being a dictatorship, and it is in practice, but it is also in practice democratic. And I'm not saying that the elections are fair, or that, say, his chief opposition isn't in prison right now for telling people to speak out against the war, or just generally from having the balls to oppose him. I'm just saying that it is possible that the Russian people say no to Putin in 2024, that 3 terms was enough, if this is how he was going to use them. I like the idea of keeping other options open and being able to find diplomatic solutions. Something like offering to allow Russia to join NATO as an interesting diplomatic option that might diffuse this situation, though it's nowhere on Russia's list of demands. But I still think it would be a smart move to offer, and for a lot of the same reasons that the USSR tried to join NATO. I think this was prior to the beginning of the Cold War, because they were effectively doing it as a way to kind of test whether or not this was an anti-Soviet alliance, figuring that, if they were denied entry, it would be proof that it was an anti-Soviet union. And if they were allowed entry, well, they had potentially neutralized an anti-Soviet union. But I do think that with, so many of Russia's demands or justifications centering around NATO, some of the ones that are accepted most around the world, I think that this would be a really interesting way to go at this. And again, maybe I don't quite get how that would backfire, but at the same time, I think it would preclude them from a lot of the brinksmanship that they are currently doing. I don't know. If you have more coherent thoughts on that, drop them in the comments. I'd be happy to read through them. But I'm not necessarily seeing a drawback here. But the thing you have to remember is that sanctions are still a form of warfare, even if it is typically thought of as a cold or benign one. And to remember that war is essentially, when you boil it all down, rich and powerful people economically opposing other rich and powerful people using their civilian populations to attempt to make other civilian populations say uncle. And it's important to know that the arm that is being twisted by sanctions is the civilians, or at least by overly broad ones. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we do have targeted sanctions that seek to kind of leave the Russian population out of it and instead target military or perhaps the oligarchs of the country, those who kind of underpin Putin's power within the country. But a lot of what we've done has been very broad and heavy-handed. It's important to remember, just like with Afghanistan, that ultimately it's not the wealthy, it's not the political upper class that are going to be the people who push for the war. And they're not going to be the people who get punished by the war. Putin isn't going to go hungry because you've sanctioned his country. Russian citizens in the middle and lower class, the way inflation is going over there, they're the people who will die, even though a bullet was not fired in their direction, at least if this continues on, if our sanctions continue on. And we are being urged to double down on them now, even though I'm not even sure what else we could do in the realm of sanctions at this point. There could be a real history of poverty left in the wake of some of these decisions, or at least it looks like that might be where this is going as a longer engagement. That will be the long-term effects of sanctions. And, maybe they will help in ending this war sooner, lowering Ukrainian casualties, lowering casualties from a longer, more protracted war that we didn't do anything about. And, that's a view that we can talk about, and it's a view that's worth discussing. But I think that you have to think about the human cost of sanctions as well. And that's something that should be weighed in the calculations at some value. And we can argue about what that value is, but I don't think that there's any point in pretending that it has no value at all. In addition to that, you have to remember that most sanctions are effectively a double-edged sword. Sanctions often also encourage retaliation. And even when they don't, say, canceled trade relationships aren't entirely one way. So remember when Trump placed soybean sanctions on China, sure, this hurt China. However, it also hurt American soybean farmers who suddenly had no one to sell their crops to because most of their crops were purchased by China before the sanctions were put in place. And that's a sanction that isn't being levied against us. That's just the effect of our sanction. That's not even talking about retaliation. It is, though, worth considering why all of the sides thought it would be best to play out the Cold War the way that they did. I think that mistakes were made on all sides, and the way that we used sanctions were among those, the way that we even cleaned up our messes after the Cold War. But I think that there's also a lesson learned, that at the very least, the techniques that we used during the Cold War kept us all from dying of nuclear explosions. So it seems like we should learn from our history, be cautious, and remember that even though it is unlikely to ultimately escalate into nuclear war, and there are a lot of potentially rational people standing in the way of Putin pressing that button who thankfully aren't as mad as he is. When you talk about nuclear weapons, we're talking about the potential for long-lasting detrimental effects. And when it's a loss of that many, many lives, and it's just not something that you gamble with, even if the odds are in your favor. Also, when talking about Russia's expected ability to weather sanctions, it's worth noting that part of the reasoning has been linked to Russians' expectations of this being a 3 to 14-day conflict in total, meaning that sanctions wouldn't have time to affect their military's ability to fight. However, this underestimate of Ukrainian forces has already backfired on them on the ground, so might it also fail economically. So the way that the world is applying sanctions, the fact that we have a lot of solidarity keeps a lot of the sanctions from backfiring very directly. Because, again, you're talking about ending a trade relationship. So it means that in a lot of small ways, a lot of countries have chosen to go without in some way or another to punish Russia for this, because the effects of sanctions can be distributed amongst all of our countries, and ultimately unified and targeted against a singular country, and thus able to have a disproportionate effect on the Russian economy compared to the effects that our own sanctions are having on our economy. However, just like I said with Trump, we should make an effort to compensate Americans for the blowback, like the blowback we're seeing at the pump. There's also retaliation. The biggest set of retaliation that we're seeing right now, I happen to have written this in my car, and I had just paid around $5 for a gallon of gas, and this was like pretty early on into the conflict. I haven't bought gas since, thankfully. I'm trying not to drive. But it is steadily going up in price. So oil prices by the barrel skyrocketed almost immediately. And in fact, they had kind of been pushing the prices upward, it seems, in preparation for the war and in collusion with Saudi Arabia. So they were kind of on this upward spike before the war happened, and then they kept going up when we started hitting them with sanctions. And in some ways, this actually allows them to, through increased profit, and, the solidarity with Saudi Arabia, because if Saudi Arabia kept their prices low, then everybody would just be able to go to them. But that solidarity keeps people buying Russian while also making up some of the money that they're losing from sanctions. So while we used to have a lot of power with Saudi Arabia and OPEC previously, we are losing a bit of that now. And you know what? I think it's a good time to just give it up, cut our losses, and shift into anchoring our economy in perhaps a nuclear power model supported by renewables like hydroelectric power in the short term, and focusing more on natural gas as a stepping stone into a cleaner power grid. Just moving away from oil entirely. And we can learn some lessons from Russia in that respect, actually. Russia, for their domestic power, uses almost entirely nuclear power. So they sell pretty much 100% of their oil and gas to the rest of the world to profit their country, or more accurately, their country's oligarchs. Great economic idea, except for the corruption and the distribution of profits within the Russian economy. We're increasingly seeing a green future as being impossible to avoid if we want a livable planet, and because of that, there's a large and still mostly untapped market for energies of the future. And I feel that having that as an export in a similar way that Saudi Arabia and Russia has oil will be a way that America can reasonably expand its economy in a future that actually benefits the planet and us. We need to race with the rest of the world to work to these solutions before other countries get ahead of us. And some of the political will to do so seems to be there with Biden. It seemed to be there with Obama as well. Hopefully, Biden is actually willing to fight for something that can make us more competitive with technology that the world will need to be retrofitted with in the coming decades. It is a huge emerging industry that we have to get a part of. And there does seem to be a political will for this within America, to cut ourselves free from Russian oil, not just through a temporary sanction, but permanently. And there is also growing sentiment to move away from Saudi Arabia as well. And even as I was writing this, even though people didn't necessarily realize what that was going to mean for prices at the pump, we almost universally wanted this. But it is important to notice that there will be an inflation of fuel prices. And fuel prices underpin so much of the economy because you have to transport your products a lot of times a long way, since very few things are made locally anymore. That's going to push up the prices of everything within the economy, not just what you pay at the pump. There's another way that you can help Ukraine, independent of our governments. You can send them money directly. There's a lot of humanitarian aid and humanitarian relief organizations that are helping Ukraine right now. Do some research, find out what the good ones are. Like how much of what they send, how much of what you send, they are actually sending to Ukraine, how much, the administrative fees or whatever are. Do your research, pick a charity, and send your money the cleanest way you can. Even sending $20. Like, look at what the Freedom Convoy did in Canada, even though they had nowhere near the popular bipartisan support that Ukraine is enjoying right now. And they were raising millions of dollars a day. So I think that what we're seeing is that a lot of like 10, 20, or even up to like $200 donations can really go a long way if enough of us decide to help a group out. Another thing that would really be important for a lot more countries around the world right now is to just go ahead and say that we're willing to accept more Ukrainian refugees. Unfortunately, a lot of European countries have been kind of doing this nativist thing where they've been kind of, especially the right wing in those countries, have been rallying against refugees for a number of years now. But usually the question of accepting refugees comes in relation to those whom the media has deemed unworthy victims. So some of the rhetoric on accepting refugees changes because the media considers Ukraine to be worthy victims. And quite a few countries might find themselves more willing to take in Ukrainian citizens than their darker-skinned counterparts. Right now, Poland is bearing a lot of the brunt of this refugee crisis, and that's why I think a lot more countries should be willing to provide support in this way if they can. You know, kind of put their money where their mouth is and say, we will take your refugees. If you can get to Poland, we'll help you get out of the country and we'll take you in hours. 100,000 people to 10 countries that are close to Ukraine could move 1 million people. And it seems like, at least early on, it was seeming like about 1 million people were leaving a week or every 2 weeks. So we need more and more countries that are willing to take in these refugees as time goes on so that no one has to deal with an influx of millions of refugees at one time. I think one of the ways that this might end that's best for everyone is that enough of the truth makes it across the borders into Russia and protests become unsustainable to put an end to while also fighting a foreign war. Massive protests lead to massive arrests and will eventually require Russia to call in some equivalent of the National Guard and or Russian military reserves. It might even force them into increased subscription, which is publicly unpopular and already will become more so as this continues. But the point is that with every troop that they have to put in the streets to quell protests and keep that shit under control is one more soldier that can't be deployed outside of Russia's borders. And this could go a long way in either encouraging revolution or encouraging the mass realization that Putin is doing the wrong thing in the Russian name. You can also potentially get to a place where the Russian military just starts saying, I'm not going to do this. You know, like they could quit. It's a thing that could happen, you know? It's not something that you really see, but they could just say, fuck this, I'm not fighting this war. It's possible. Given the civilian consequences of sanctions and societal collapse, there are all these ways that this war could end without us having to go that route. We must be careful in how we target the innocent, even when it's not a drone that we're targeting them with. This is why informational warfare alongside of diplomacy, as well as the power of civilian protests, are so important and powerful here. Because they don't rely on human suffering to come to an outcome for Ukraine. Thinking about all of our lethal aid, all of our sanctions, we must remember that while we're applying this pressure, that we should also be looking for a diplomatic way out for Ukraine as well. I would like to see Ukraine retain its full sovereignty because I would like to see them take control of their own future. As of a few weeks in, the diplomatic offers coming out of the Kremlin aren't entirely ridiculous, but they are asking for a lot to end this. The things Putin seems to want out of this conflict are the following: Ukraine's recognition of the independence of Luhansk and Donetsk, as well as the annexation of Crimea, a binding agreement not to join any other union of nations, such as, and including the EU and NATO, demilitarization and the complete disarmament of Ukraine, which they claim to be doing now. Behind the scenes, they're also talking about allowing Zelensky to stay in power as long as they're able to... Wow. This is almost exactly season 1 of Servant of the People. Holy shit. He's in power. the Russian and oligarch-backed groups have got the prime minister in power to keep him away from doing any of the really radical things the whole season. He only realizes at the very end. So and behind the scenes, they're talking about Zelensky staying on as the president, and then them choosing the prime minister and somebody who'll kind of keep him in line, and kind of leaving him there as a puppet, as the president of kind of a puppet regime that he doesn't necessarily have control over. Although that hasn't been said officially in negotiations. More recently, about 3 weeks in, we saw a second set of demands coming in from the Kremlin, and these were different in that demilitarization and disarmament of Ukraine ended up getting softened to removal of offensive capabilities instead of, removing their ability to defend themselves or their defensive capabilities. And that the amendment to their constitution, which was previously set to keep them from joining any union of nations, and they are actually in a trilateral agreement with the UK and Poland right now, so they've already kind of violated that. They've reduced that down to just being the EU and NATO, which would allow them to stay in that agreement and also make others, so long as they are not the EU and NATO. So what this says, and we'll get more into this when we start talking about what has been happening on the ground. I'm going to go by that the first month of combat week by week. You'll kind of understand that as of 3 weeks in, Russia isn't in the same position of power they thought they were, because things just have gone downhill for them. So naturally, they are basically negotiating from a weakened place of power. Now, how the next few days from the moment that I am recording this play out, and I should have an answer for this by the time I actually get to that video, which I won't be recording at least for another couple days until perhaps the fields in northern Ukraine have thawed, which really is, and that's something that's kind of wild about this, just how important whether or not the fields have thawed is in this whole conflict. But I should know an answer to that by the time I record that video. So as we're applying this pressure, let's remember, this is not suffering for suffering's sake. That we are doing these sanctions not to make people miserable, but to get Russia to come to the bargaining table. And yes, sanctions may play a role in this. Military and military defectors will help as well. We're already seeing this, by the way, play a key role in the fighting near Belarus. The Belarusian military was supposed to go in on day one, but at this point that has been massively delayed, and key Belarusian officials have actually stepped down and saying that they won't do what the Russians want them to in Ukraine. However, they are still allowing Russian troops to enter Ukraine through Belarus. And the changing of the guard in Belarus might get someone who is more willing to work with Putin, although we haven't really seen a major Belarusian deployment even now. So that's good news. Ultimately, I think that all of these things just give more reason to accept a lesser outcome for Putin diplomatically. We've got to remember that while we may feel justified in supporting some of these actions, that they do have negative consequences that we should aim to end in this as quickly as possible through diplomatic means. This series has been going on for hours now, and I've still only hinted at pieces of what is going on the ground. And that's in part because I think that all of this context and your familiarity with all of these topics is going to be important to understanding how some of the people you'll see on the news moving forward will be framing this, and what their narratives are missing. I mean, you've got Hillary Clinton on TV saying that when Russia invaded Afghanistan, that didn't go well for them. And ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union, but then admitting that there were some unintended consequences of that. Well, I'm glad you said it, but I think the unintended consequences that resulted in 30 additional years of imperialist wars, in the U.S. committing state terrorism against several sovereign governments, as well as propping up and encouraging the terrorist organizations that terrorized the other side of these organizations for a number of years. And yeah, there's a lot of fucking unintended consequences very much worth talking about. And that statement does not do credit to the situation caused by it, and I'd think a fucking warhawk like Hillary Clinton would know that. And I've seen so many half-assed historical references that I thought that maybe it would just be interesting to get into the history behind those remarks. There's a lot of people like her out there pushing for escalations that would lead us eventually to a more formal war. At least for the early coverage of this, I would say that the mainstream media did a pretty good job, like for the first couple of days. Yes, the right wing was certifiably off their rockers for maybe the first 2 days, and after that, I think they polled the American people and realized that we do not side with Russia on this issue. And it's a losing battle to try to fight for Putin on American soil. So they all rapidly changed their tune, like literally overnight. It feels like the news media came together for a moment to do what it was designed for. This is kind of another 9/11 type scenario. This is another one of those, you'll remember where you were when you found out about it type scenarios. This is another one of those, the world changed dramatically geopolitically after this date and time scenarios. And again, as I pointed out with the cable media, they're really designed to operate in circumstances like this. And I think that a lot of their issues just disappeared for a moment as they took the story seriously. But over time, we're figuring out how to turn this into a cultural or political issue. Because the other end of that 9/11 comparison is to note how the media worked to manufacture consent for war as we became bored with the constant coverage of the attacks. But for a brief moment, a brief window in time, I was actually proud while I was writing this, which is a few weeks ago now. And at the time, I was also briefly proud of the Biden administration. I think that the way that Biden had reached out, had reacted to the information or the laying of blame that his administration did was perfectly reasonable. And this was more or less before the invasion happened. It was an increasingly tense situation that could have been set off by the premature application of sanctions, which many people were calling for. And Biden said, as people were asking him and his administration over and over and over about sanctions, that we don't want to escalate the situation, and that we're going to wait until Putin makes his invasion clear, and we're going to respond then through sanctions, and only then. And as updates on the ground have come out time and time again, while I no longer feel that he was able to avoid the escalation of sanctions that I just gave him credit for, his administration continues to reaffirm that we will not get into a boots-on-the-ground conflict. And I think that those are all great positions to take, though they're also very geopolitically safe and, dare I say, obvious. Still, I'd been beginning to not expect the US state to respond to much of anything, especially like this, rationally. And at least for a week, we did a good job. Wars, as you know, are often a fight over land or money. And increasingly over the last century, oil has become a proxy for money itself. It's through the control of oil that several imperial governments maintain their economic control over the world. America is no exception to this, using OPEC and petrodollar economics to strengthen our own currency and increase our soft power capabilities across the world. And we do this in coordination with Saudi Arabia and other oil-producing nations in the region. Increasingly, oil is the blood of war, and it plays an important part in this conflict as well. Don't get me wrong, Russia is more likely invading for wheat than oil, or precisely the fertile land that grows the wheat. Without Soviet-era connections, Russia's barrenness has become a bit of an obstacle to its growth. After the Munich Security Council, where Volodymyr Zelensky called upon Europe to take action against Russia, Germany, being the endpoint of Nord Stream and Nord Stream 2 pipelines, decided that perhaps because of this they would sign an agreement with America that said that if Putin were to escalate in Ukraine, that they would turn off the newly completed Nord Stream 2 pipeline. I think it's foolish to try to say that any one particular thing led to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, even if the timing of it does seem strange, and I think that it was inevitable even if everyone did the right thing. However, this particular sanction is likely to have some proximate effect on the exact timing of the Russian invasion. And while I just got done giving Biden credit for not pursuing these types of preemptive sanctions, this does appear to be an exception to that. And it was met with blowback, as Russia and Saudi Arabia colluded to increase their oil prices even further to the rest of the world simultaneously, which has driven up oil prices to the profit of the Saudi monarchy and the Russian state throughout this crisis. I do want to give Joe Biden a bit of credit, though, for being willing to sanction U.S. oil imports from Russia, even though Russia doesn't make up a lot of the oil that this country imports, and even though we are a bit more energy independent than other nations, especially those in Europe. We are actually even a net exporter of energy. While he will likely be politically blamed for this as the reason that oil prices are about to go up, really most of that cause is a combination of price gouging from oil-producing nations, as well as companies within the country that are seeing this as an excuse to raise prices and thus their profits even higher. Make no mistake, watch these oil companies because their stock prices will likely go up because of this, even as American oil consumption will likely go down. It's important to realize and remember that a lot of these price gouging issues could have been taken care of by Joe Biden, and one way to do this would even be the nationalization of our oil industry, which is a step that I don't think that he's likely to take. However, it is important to note that he could do this, and it's important to note that there are a number of countries, both foreign dictatorships and peaceful democracies, that have done this to the great benefit of their people. In these states, this has enabled the government to more effectively respond to internal problems. The "how are you going to pay for it" question becomes a lot easier to answer, at least, when nationalized oil profits are high and capable of paying for a great number of public works and social safety net programs even by itself. In fact, there's a theory that I heard that I think could work very well through nationalization, and that is that there be sort of a dividend made from American oil companies that would be used to fund effectively a universal basic income for the American people off of our oil industry. And this is actually pretty similar to how a lot of other oil-rich countries do, especially the more democratic ones, where the money tends to be spread around a lot more than just enriching a monarchy, or a few key oligarchs in Russia. The most immediate benefit of nationalization, in addition to factoring out the oil lobby in the decision-making process of the United States, will be that this would give the government the ability to create price controls and factor out the types of price gouging at the pump that we are seeing today. Because, make no mistake, the majority of the inflation of the price that you are paying to fill up your vehicle doesn't come from the effects of policy, but instead the exacerbation of those effects because of individual greed.
Oil prices dropped below $100 a barrel on Tuesday, down from $130 a barrel last week. Senator Bernie Sanders pointed out the dip in costs, saying, "Why is the price of oil lower today than it was in 2014, while the average price for a gallon of gas is 80 cents more?" The answer: corporate greed.
But let's return our focus to the Nord Stream pipeline and the history of sanctions against it, which have been ongoing since the beginning of the construction of Nord Stream 1, and have been egged on by numerous American presidents, starting with Bush and, most recently, Biden. Now, all of these presidents have had a concern that European dependence on Russian oil would make them geopolitically weaker in a situation such as this. And it's worth noting that we are seeing exactly that playing out right now. Because while European sanctions are having an effect on the Russian economy and its ability to support a war machine in the long term, the most effective sanctions that Europe could levy against Russia right now are related to the oil market, and their dependence on Russian oil and natural gas is making it politically impossible for them to follow suit with America. The Nord Stream pipeline in this way is a good example of the constant tension that America has aimed at Russia. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, we never really gave them an opportunity to be their own state. Instead, the world largely treated Russia as if it were still the Soviet Union, which is reflected in many places, including the UN, where Russia was the inheritor of the Soviet Union's place on the Council, and also inherited the Soviet Union's powers within the United Union, such as their veto power, which they used to stop the UN Security Council from being able to intervene in this crisis, interestingly enough. And while these may not have been the wrong decisions to make at that time, this does not mean that it is impossible to imagine that the chain of events in the 1990s that could have brought us closer to Russia and could have brought Europe closer with Russia in such a way that this wouldn't be seen as the geopolitical machinations of an opposing state, but instead normal trade relations within a broadened concept of the European Union. And it should be said that Germany's actions in enforcing the Nord Stream 2 pipeline shutdown were incredibly politically brave, and ultimately the right thing to do, even if the timing could have been a little bit better. Though, part of the reason that they were willing to agree to this is that modern Germany has a dispassion for war more deeply seated than most European countries, but also thanks to them recently shutting down domestic nuclear power plants. Because of the abundance of cheap energy coming in through the Nord Stream, they are now more dependent on Russian energy than most countries, and are among the only European countries to flat out declare that it would be impossible to sanction Russian energy in any meaningful way from their country because of this. But it reminds us, all of us globally, that our dependence on these authoritarian or imperialist states for a product that we already know is damaging the world, it reminds us that our national sovereignty may be, in some way, come to rest upon our own energy independence. And while we aren't so reliant on Russian oil or gas, we are deeply intertwined with the Saudi Arabian oil kingdom. The more that we use, it makes a damn good case for all countries to seek their own energy independence. As I have mentioned here, I think that the best way to do that long term would be through heavy investments long term in nuclear power, as well as investments in future nuclear technology as well, especially those nuclear technologies that might be able to use more traditional nuclear waste, which is a problem that already exists and isn't going away, so we might as well figure out how to deal with that while we are invigorating nuclear power production. Because while it hasn't been as well funded as it could have been, research into new designs of nuclear power generation have become safer, more sophisticated, smaller, and more efficient since the world went on its last nuclear power building spree. And we can already see how that nuclear power, where it still exists, supports each nation's ability to remain energy independent and thus politically independent from these nations. Unfortunately, though, nuclear power is a solution that, even if we're talking about some of these smaller and more theoretical reactors, would take a little while even if we started building them overnight. Which is exactly why we should also start building a more immediate solution. Weather-dependent electrical solutions are not ideal because they're ultimately intermittent, and intermittency just isn't something that our energy system can rely on. However, they do have a lot of place in building out green infrastructure rapidly. As we work on longer-term solutions like nuclear power, I think another good, clean source of energy comes from hydroelectric power, which unfortunately can have damaging effects on local environments. But it is very safe and an effective form of power that can be deployed in at least a number of places. Though, while it is nowhere near as universal as some other methods of electrical generation, and to fill those gaps we should be thinking about something like natural gas, which compared to other fossil fuels burns much cleaner in terms of carbon released. And you could make your arguments against this. However, practically speaking, without things like this, we are seeing situations where we're firing up or creating new coal or oil-powered plants now, which we know are bad for the environment, but it's being done because it's a known technology and because it can be built quickly and known to perform reliably. And all of this is going to drive a lot of pushes to expand drilling. I've already heard people on the right calling for the lifting of rules against drilling in national parks, for example. I would absolutely hate to see this jewel that is the U.S. national park system destroyed in such a way for purely short-term gains, for purely short-term gains, when we could be building into long-term solutions that don't hurt our future carbon policy goals. Our plans in this regard shouldn't be either or, but more of an all-of-the-above strategy focused on increasing our national energy independence while lowering costs to the consumer and the amount of carbon emissions. And local clean power is an excellent way of killing two birds with one stone. This is also a concept that can be taken one step further. All of our basic supply chains, all of those that are most fundamental to the operation of our country, should be located within our borders as much as possible. It will take a lot of effort in building out on our part, but the prosperity and independence it will return to our country will be worth it. And to that end, I am actually grateful for Biden to address this during the State of the Union address. However, I would like to see some, firm action on how this would be done. If we do this, we have not adequately prepared for the incoming monster of increased changes to our climate and all of the unpredictability that brings. COVID will not be the last time that our increasingly interdependent supply chains fail all over the world at once. And when it happens again, it will likely be at the most inconvenient possible time. We have already seen this being incredibly destructive to our crumbling infrastructure. And these things will only get worse with time if we ignore them. But right now, it's also important to think of this from the geopolitical perspective. That one of the reasons why Russia is able to keep its economy afloat right now, in spite of sanctions, is because they can depend on our geopolitical dependence on their oil and natural gas abroad. If it were not for this, then our sanctions would be more effective in putting a quick stop to this conflict than they currently are. We perhaps wouldn't have to worry about how long it's going to take for sanctions to have enough effect to be a real deterrent. We could turn off the pumps overnight and cripple their entire economy. In a way, that would be an absolute geopolitical disaster for Putin, in a way that all of our collective sanctions haven't quite been yet. And while we're talking about Russia's resistance to international sanctions, it seems that a large part of this thinking is reliant on Chinese dependence. For example, when we cut them off from credit and banking systems that have become standard in the West, they shifted to a newer Chinese alternative to those systems, legitimizing a bipolar economic system in the world and increasing China's geopolitical power by making Russia more of a dependent state than they ever have been before, which is to say that China has a lot of power in this relationship. But also to say that while China is looking for a greater and more dominant place in the world, they're also quite happy and profiting from the current system, which they have learned how to game quite effectively. And while I am sure that they would rather have the dominant position within this system, or perhaps have their own system be dominant over the Western system, in the short term, the uniformity with which the world that China relies upon as a consumer has rallied against Russia in this conflict, making it almost geopolitically impossible for China to come to Russia's defense in a more meaningful way. And we have seen that this alliance is a lot more uneasy than perhaps Putin has assumed it to be before the conflict started. I think it's also leading to a point where Putin is going to realize that his economy isn't nearly as insulated from the rest of the world as he assumed through this relationship, and that in fact, as Russia is weakened, I believe it will become increasingly geopolitically and economically dependent on China, therefore putting itself into a similar situation that the Nord Stream pipelines were designed to put on Europe in relation to Russia. I also don't think that this means that China is about to jump into Taiwan, while everyone else is distracted in Ukraine, as I have heard mentioned. I don't necessarily think that that means that Taiwan is safe long term. I do think that there are reasons to be concerned about that particular impending crisis. But I don't think that it's going to be happening soon for sure. And, I think this is turning into an approximation, and I really don't see this turning into an approximation of the Cold War, because they're not fighting the Soviet Union. Ukraine is fighting Russia, specifically fighting a weakened Russia, fighting a more globally dependent Russia. And we've all become significantly more globally dependent since the 1990s, Russia being no exception to that. They've just done more things to make the world more economically dependent on them in return. Today we're going to be talking about the situation on the ground in Ukraine. Now, I've referenced it before in this video, but today we're going to be taking a week-by-week look at the first 4 weeks-ish of this invasion. The long and short of what I'm saying here is that Vladimir Putin is not only doing a horrible thing that the Russian people are actually beginning to notice, and also a number of oligarchs at this point, but that it is also an ill-advised thing to do based on terrain, military strategy, and other factors. So before we see this video series out, it seems like we should finally talk about the way that things are going on the ground. And I think that it's good to get a grounded perspective on what the state of play was weeks before the invasion, but also to get an idea of what's been going on here since the beginning. Just to give you a full-scale idea of the intensity of the Russian fuck-up we're discussing here. Now, I'm largely going to be framing a lot of this in Ukraine's favor, and make no mistake, they are going up against a formidable enemy, and this will not be easy by any means for them. Ukraine, even now, remains the underdog in this situation a month in. However, at this moment, I also see plenty of good reasons to root for this particular underdog. And let me walk you through them. First, let's consider the Ukrainian military. Would they be able to stop a Russian invasion? Yes and no. Now, they have improved a lot since 2014 when the Donbass War started, but they're also being outnumbered here 5-1 overall. They have a similar deficit in equipment as well, or at least they did at the beginning of the conflict, though their equipment, which is flooded in from advanced militaries from around the world, is considerably newer and more capable. These deficits aren't actually as bad as they first sound, though, as Russia has a lot of military commitments already, and a sizable force needed to secure their borders alone. They also suffer issues in deployment which are somewhat mitigated by the 4-month buildup at the border. But an infrastructural issue that Russia faces in mobilization against Ukraine is that the only quick way across Russia for heavy equipment, at this time of year especially, is their somewhat limited rail system, which is a bit more concentrated around their capital. However, they do have troops stationed in the ready, both in Crimea to the south and Belarus to the north, so this invasion can happen from basically all sides at once with Russian Navy support in the west. But Ukraine's biggest disadvantage is having no real way to control their own skies, which will likely lead to a lot of bombing to support ground troops who very much do not have their work cut out for them. Their likely strategy seems to be to blitz the country quickly. There's a lot of talk about quickly taking the head of the government, perhaps like they had in Afghanistan in a number of 3 days. How they intend to make this advance in Ukraine remains to be seen, but a situation like the encirclement of Kyiv is looking unlikely within the first week, and much less likely that they can achieve a governmental takeover in this time. So with all of that being said, would Russia be able to steamroll Ukraine in a matter of days? I don't think so. In the case of an all-out invasion, I assumed that they would make quick personal victories in some areas, but also get bogged down in others, and advancing only with significant losses. Despite being outnumbered, Ukrainians have a number of very useful pieces of military hardware on their hands, with almost every major country sending them more as time passes and Russia continues to build up troops at the border. What we see in front of us seems to be a rather hasty plan B that most likely wasn't the original plan. For one, timing is off in regards to the weather, which is forcing early Russian invasion efforts to a crawl. The mobilization we saw to the borders now appears to be the easy part, as Russian convoys are already stuck in the mud and running out of gas. Russia's more realistic plan was to use the threat of invasion to strong-arm NATO on the fact that peace and stability are more important to NATO than Ukraine's sovereignty. This, however, turned out not to be the case, as the Western response was united and consistent, basically calling Putin on his bluff. At that point, Putin didn't have much choice since he's been posturing for 4 months already. Russia had to go ahead at this point, essentially just making sure, upon entry, to find a way to accuse Ukraine of suddenly wanting to invade the Donbass in service of some hasty false flag events that have followed and are bordering on ridiculous. I hate to say it, but the Alex Jones-styled conspiracy theorists in the US State Department were right on this one. According to Russia, they parked their troops on the border to end tensions with the local Russian population. That's when Ukraine suddenly decided to start provoking them, again, according to Russia, a country with the world's most nuclear weapons and the army 5 times their size. Totally plausible narrative that they would just provoke them out of nowhere. Ukrainians did not invade past the front lines of the Donbass for 8 years of conflict. But they wanted to now when Russia poses 150,000 troops across the border and are threatening a full-scale invasion under the pretext of protecting Russian speakers. Yeah, that really seems likely. Perhaps the reason why all these false flags were so half-baked is this is again a hasty plan B. And it would appear that Putin has basically trapped himself in this situation because if he stopped now, all he would have achieved is taking the separatist regions, officially, which they controlled anyways, but these are also economic black holes and destroyed assets and infrastructure, with most of the populations gone, and for this they get sanctioned and turned into international pariahs. And Nord Stream 2 is now suspended indefinitely. Putin can't really backpedal at this point. And at this point, the only potential beneficial choice for break-even is to press on and try to achieve the strategic goals he has set out to the people in Ukraine. This includes the land bridge to Crimea, severing Ukraine from the Black Sea, and at a worst-case scenario, annexing the entire country. Ukraine is currently experiencing warm, wet weather, meaning that the ground couldn't freeze enough to allow quick passage for armored vehicles in the north and the east of the country, because during the thaw, the ground in these regions are practically quagmires. This negates the possibility of a blitzkrieg, meaning defenders can better prepare and potentially do more damage to the Russian army struggling in the mud. Also, as a rule of thumb, attackers tend to lose more troops and equipment than their defenders, and all the Western-provided military equipment is also a major problem for them. Ukraine now has all sorts of advanced hardware which can do serious damage to Russian hardware. So even though the Russian army is larger and more powerful, the unfavorable terrain, the defenders, and the Western weapons, Russian soldiers are risking heavy casualties, and the troops' morale is just not that high to begin with. This isn't Crimea. It won't be a short, libelous campaign followed by Russian celebrations. This will also be Russia's first large-scale army logistical undertaking since 1945 against a modern mechanized army. The worst-case scenario would be them taking severe losses due to unexpectedly high resistance, supply chain problems, sabotage, and so on. Thus, the high casualties leading to severe domestic instability back home, which then cascades into more logistical problems for the army, loss of morale, and increases losses even further. Wash, rinse, repeat until Russia suddenly collapses under the weight of the crises it has created. However, this is an optimistic take, and even that would take some time. What Russian forces seem to have wanted out of this invasion, based on documents found in destroyed columns, was to get the government shut down within 2 weeks and to achieve all of Putin's objectives. Yet, we're now 2 weeks in, and Russians aren't even close to achieving any objectives. For example, Russia severely miscalculated by planning for low resistance and hoping for a quick advance. The plan seems to have been the following: break out of Crimea to the south, Belarus to the north, Russia Donbass to the east, and use ships moving into the Black Sea to put pressure on Odessa. While doing so, paradrop troopers into strategic locations to meet up with invading troops and secure key infrastructure, while bombing what they think they couldn't take in an effort to cut out any potential reinforcements. From here, the plan was to coordinate and begin to encircle major targets like Kyiv, and set to take cities within the first 2 weeks after campaigns of air raids to soften them up and drive civilian resistance out of high-value targets, and voila! Ukraine is annexed before the West can recover from its confusion.
They even pre-wrote an article for this occasion, which people found on the RIA Novosti website, titled Russia's Offensive and the New World. It's Google translated to English. Russia is restoring its unity. The tragedy of 1991, this terrible catastrophe in our history, its unnatural dislocation, has been overcome. Yes, at a great cost. Yes, through the tragic events of a virtual civil war, because now brothers, separated by belonging to the Russian and Ukrainian armies, are still shooting at each other, but there will be no more Ukraine as anti-Russia. Russia is restoring its historical fullness, gathering the Russian world, the Russian people, together in its entirety of Great Russians, Belarusians, and the Little Russians. If we had abandoned this, if we had allowed the temporary division to take hold for centuries, then we would not only betray the memory of our ancestors, but also be cursed by our descendants for allowing the disintegration of the Russian land. Vladimir Putin has assumed, without a drop of exaggeration, a historic responsibility by deciding not to leave the solution of the Ukrainian question for future generations. After all, the need to solve it would always remain the main problem for Russia, for two key reasons, and the issue of national security, that is, the creation of anti-Russia from Ukraine as an outpost for the West to put pressure on us, is only the second most important among them. Now this problem is gone. Ukraine has returned to Russia. This does not mean that its statehood will be liquidated, but it will be reorganized, re-established, and returned to its natural state as part of the Russian world. In what borders, in what form will the alliance with Russia be fixed, through the CSTO and the Eurasian Union, or the Union State of Russia and Belarus? This will will be decided after the end dispute in the history of Ukraine as anti-Russia. In any case, the period of the split of the Russian people is coming to an end. This is literal Nazi shit, by the way. Territorial conquest based on ethno-nationalism, aiming to restore the mythical past greatness of Russia. Oh, by the way, the Russian invasion is officially called Special Military Operation to denazify Ukraine. Go figure.
Putin's invasion began by unloading on Ukraine with ballistic missile launches at military bases, airports, and so on. This was done to cripple Ukrainian defenses as well as their chain of command, and send them into chaos so that Russians can just roll in and take them out easily. However, Ukrainians got information from NATO just in time and managed to shuffle things around right before the strikes. Most things didn't get destroyed, most equipment survived, and fortunately the chain of command remained intact. As for their paratroopers, their most elite special forces personnel, well, most were shot down while in the air, others were ambushed on the ground since Ukraine got good info on their targets. This was a major ace in the hole for Russia that was almost immediately wasted in a hasty invasion. So why are Russians moving in easy-to-ambush columns instead of simply rolling through the countryside? The answer is the mild weather turning the countryside into swamps, and getting stuck in the mud is only one of the reasons why they're having so much problems. The second reason is the lack of tire maintenance. Turns out, if you have vehicles, you need to move them around at least once a month, otherwise their tires start to decay and become brittle. And if you decrease pressure at that point, they will simply tear themselves apart. Due to narrow roads, no remaining connections to the Russian rail network, and a few strategically blown up bridges, the Russian advance has been consistently set to a crawl, and plagued with shortages of essential rations. And within days, there were cases of Russian soldiers looting grocery stores for food and knocking on doors to ask for food and fuel. Since they're being forced to travel in single file and risk ruining their tires or simply getting stuck in the mud, a single vehicle running out of fuel can stop a 40-mile convoy. And a 40-mile convoy is bound to have multiple vehicles running out of fuel at any given moment. The issues of being logistically unprepared for a longer invasion are becoming more and more apparent as the struggle wages on, pushing past any expectations of resistance that the Russians had calculated. And though Russians do have a larger military overall, this poor deployment means a number of things. Convoys are easily trolled with Javelin missiles or even Molotov cocktails, which tend to be more effective on soft targets like personnel carriers, but are likely to be less effective against trained military officers and/or armored targets. However, losing any vehicle in a convoy brings all the hassles of a vehicle running out of fuel and then some. This makes for a main strategy that's almost laughably easy for a few well-armed insurgents to stall for days, compounding their logistical issues and need for more rations and fuel than they had expected. But even when this isn't the case, due to the massive popularity of Ukraine's arming themselves in resistance, Russian forces who are showing up to battle are often massively overwhelmed and outnumbered, and find themselves facing fortified opponents the moment they try to advance on cities. And about all those abandoned tanks you've seen broken down all over Ukraine, for one reason or another. Each one represents about $16 million in Russian assets that, when abandoned, aren't particularly easy to steal, but aren't terribly hard to ruin with fire either, making them unusable if Russian soldiers return for them later. In the meantime, Russians have switched to indiscriminate bombing of civilians in an attempt to reclaim or take cities and certain infrastructure, which is a war crime, by the way, but also a sign of their frustration. And yet, rolling their tanks through the countryside was supposed to be the easy part, and now they've already turned this element into a massive fuck-up. Taking cities, but especially holding them when you face a highly motivated and armed insurgency, that is the hard part, and maintaining this state of affairs is the expensive part. For right now, fighting in the south seems to be the most dire, and could be a stepping stone to furthering the invasion towards Kyiv and capturing a large amount of land in the south, so for now, this is an area to keep an eye on. So far, these are the mighty Russia's lasting successes. Russia has taken control of the nuclear ruins of Chernobyl, and have fun with that, I guess. I'm pretty sure this is grade A land that no one wants to deal with, even if it does allow them an irradiated forward base in advancing towards Kyiv. In more dangerous news, Russian forces have overtaken Ukraine's nuclear power plant, which supplies the country with about 25% of its power. This is obviously a much more disadvantageous and dangerous situation. However, I don't think it's Russia's intention to necessarily weaponize this. For one, if they're trying to take over the area, it's good to have that intact, and I think it's far more likely that they're going to use this to shut off parts of the Ukrainian power grid in coordination with evasion attempts later on. And that's certainly something to watch out for with the power plant. But it's also worth noting that they've already set one of the buildings near it on fire in their invasion of it. And one wrong move here could be not only disastrous for Ukraine, but all of the surrounding countries, including Russia. And this kind of recklessness might go a long way in unifying many of those countries against Russia. Little has changed with a few key differences. At this point, Russia has dumped pretty much the entirety of their available invasion troops into Ukraine and is now relying on Chechenian reinforcements to bolster their ranks, although Chechenians are also bolstering the Ukrainian ranks as well at the same time, so this is not necessarily effective as they're running to both sides. Russia can reinforce its deployed troops, but new troops would have to be transported and staged at the border beforehand, so this isn't an immediate solution to any of their continuing problems. Despite this, very little seems to have changed on the ground, with Russian forces and their convoys still largely stuck outside of Ukrainian cities. And these are also largely out of supplies, just to make matters worse. This has been a running problem throughout the engagement that's only gotten worse as time moves on. Russia has begun shelling targets in the west now, which has been previously left unscathed, as seen in the bombing of a military base near the Polish border. Some of the ground in the north has refrozen, meaning that for now the Russian advance is easier in some places since they don't have to combat the mud anymore. It seems that the Ukrainians' tactics involve not wasting their rockets and limited time in the air with drones on tanks. Instead, they focus them primarily on combat posts and supply columns. They don't really have any other choice. You'd need to fly hundreds of drones to hit every tank with an anti-armor rocket, and at that point, we haven't even considered the other vehicles yet. The Ukrainian tactics can therefore be summarized as not wanting to eliminate advancing Russian soldiers, because eliminating them entirely would be difficult if not impossible to begin with. They do want to isolate the areas where Russian forces have advanced to, cutting them off from supplies and their command structure. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian infantry takes out 6 to 12 tanks per day in sporadic missions, but just enough that no tanker will feel safe. Much of the info these attacks rely on is coming from NATO and US intelligence services. In isolation without supplies, Russian soldiers face the frozen landscape of northern Ukraine with little in the way of comfort or aid, and since the cold snap, this evidence has emerged of Russian soldiers who seem to have died of exposure to the elements. Ukraine is still calling for a no-fly zone to put an end to the increasingly savage bombing runs carried out by the Russians, one recently hitting a maternity center. However, many within the country are making it clear that despite what is now an unprecedented Russian deployment in the modern era, the Ukrainian people now need weapons, but not bodies, to fight this conflict. Despite there being no draft, voluntary efforts to defend Ukraine have been a tremendous success, and at this point Ukraine still has numerous troops in its reserves whom it hasn't felt the need to call into battle, instead trying to focus on maintaining what normality they can for the citizens that haven't fled the country. While outnumbering Ukraine 10-1 in the air, Russia has yet to dominate the skies over Ukraine, and Ukraine still has most of its planes in reserve, and seems to be using UAVs for aerial attacks on supply lines. Air defenses also remain intact, and with an intel advantage, air defenses can be placed strategically to intercept an incoming bombing run, while at the same time moving the equipment that the bombing run is meant to target. There are suggestions that Russian aerial equipment, much like what we're seeing on the ground, was poorly maintained and may not even be fully operational by modern standards. Still, the overwhelming numbers continue to allow them to keep pushing forward despite major losses to Ukrainian air defenses. It's also worth noting that with the Russian Air Force, in addition to their outdated and poorly maintained equipment, they're also poorly trained themselves, with the average Russian pilot having half the training in the air as even a UN pilot. Which leads to a second problem. Without in-depth training, there is little or no hope of Russian pilots being able to make large coordinated attacks, which is what they would need to overwhelm and eliminate Ukrainian air defenses and gain air superiority, signaling that since it hasn't happened yet, and was one of their day one goals, it might not happen at all. Even still, Russian aircraft claim the lives of civilians on the ground every day. It's also worth mentioning that with the amount of Russian equipment that's been abandoned or reclaimed in Ukraine, that might actually make the Russian military the biggest donor of arms to Ukraine in the world right now by some estimations, which is especially wild considering how the US recently upped our funding to Ukraine to over $10 billion. And actually in the weeks since this, we're sending a lot of air defenses now, but they're really getting everything they could possibly want from everywhere. previous calls for weapons, not bodies, these were heard by the world, or at least those in the world who sell those type of weapons. So it's probably no longer true, if it ever was, that the Russian military could be thought of as the largest donor to Ukraine in this. Although maybe that was true for a brief window of time. The battle is still raging in the south, and victory here could be critically important for either side in the long run. But in the north, a battle to gain footing around Kyiv remains a losing one for Russian soldiers. However, the plan seems to be to continue the northern and southern advances until they meet in the middle of Ukraine around Kyiv. And it's worth noting that Russia is well supplied in the south because of control of Crimea. Though there is always the chance that the Russians can gain the upper hand in this by acting more and more brutally toward Ukrainian citizens, right now they seem to be on a track no longer for a Pyrrhic victory, but a humiliating defeat. Additionally, each attack against civilians will only serve to further radicalize the Ukrainian population, meaning that even in the case of capturing Ukraine, its citizens will only be more willing to commit acts of insurgency against those who would remain to control Ukraine in the event of foreign occupation by Russia, while at the same time galvanizing the world against them, which will likely continue to alienate them from their few allies in the world, such as China, Saudi Arabia, and Belarus. Given the current situation, it would seem that once this offense peters out, and its result will be the occupation of swampy fields, then Russians will be left with the chance to pull out or to commit some insanity. There is 2 to 3 days of frost left at the time I wrote this, and the mild weather will return afterwards. The situation is critical for both sides at this moment because ammo and supplies are running out on the Ukrainian side as well, even if they do happen to have better logistics and are easily supplied through the west, like the west of Ukraine, but also the number of countries in the west that are shipping things in through the west of Ukraine. It's also worth pointing out that they don't need hundreds of tons of gasoline to fortify their cities against Russian invasion, whereas invading Russian troops need a lot of fuel to pull this off. This will be my final report unless something else really important happens. We're pretty close to the 1-month anniversary of this conflict, and pretty much everything that I've told you in this episode so far has held. Major advances weren't made in the south, major advances weren't made around Kyiv, things seem to be stalled in pretty much all directions. The only way that Russians seem to really be advancing this war is through escalating civilian casualties. They don't really seem to have a strategy beyond that. There's a report on the ground that Russian military forces have taken 400 hostages and are holding them inside of a hospital that they have taken, and using them essentially as human shields for the moment, which you'll remember is exactly the propaganda that they said that the Ukrainian militants were using, which just further kind of proves this predictive power of whatever Russia says their opponents are doing is going to be the thing that they are considering doing in a few days. But outside of that, the issues that I had anticipated with a sudden frost causing the potential for a sudden Russian advance seems to have amounted to exactly nothing. The battles that we have been watching in the south, while bloody, haven't really amounted to much for Russia. While Ukraine continues to call for a no-fly zone to be implemented, they're actually doing quite well in the skies. Though this is despite the amount of civilian casualties that are being caused by bombing runs. And a lot of this is more like artillery, like shelling. It's not necessarily entirely aerial bombing runs. Ukraine is actually ruling the skies with their drones, which are being shipped in from all sorts of places. It seems like there are going to be new kamikaze drones being shipped in from America, along with an absolutely insane list of military hardware coming from the collective West. And this emphasizes a point that I haven't really talked about in relation to the geological dynamics of this situation, and that is that there's a border with Poland to the west of Ukraine, and the entire western side of Ukraine, with the exception of a few in recent escalated shellings and aerial attacks, are pretty safe. So compared to the way that eastern Ukraine is being hit right now, western Ukraine is being hit by absolutely nothing in comparison, like not even a scratch compared to what's happening in a place like Mariupol. But the fact that it is still open and still serves as a logistical pathway that allows all sorts of foreign aid to be backdoored into Ukraine. While Russia is attempting to limit the spread of that, trying to utilize their navy in the Black Sea, they have not successfully really encircled anything. And reports are that now they have even failed to take the suburbs of Kyiv. They're still a way out in the country even now, which is approximately where they were a couple weeks ago. This is not to say that there isn't a sort of horizontal progress that's been made. It's not to say that Russians haven't advanced the front lines in other places or begun to kind of spread out, essentially. But they're facing lower and lower reinforcement as the week goes on, and as they spread out, they're also seeing that the Ukrainians are seeing this as an opportunity to pounce. And we're seeing, with all these state-of-the-art tactical weapon systems that we're seeing flood into Ukraine, they're really capitalizing on this opportunity to decisively strike back. And this hints at something that has been in some ways kind of absent, and that's a uniform military-like official military response. Because we're seeing a lot of conscripts and a lot of little skirmishes. But right now, and mostly, just people defending their cities, but we haven't really seen a lot more than kind of skirmishes and javelin runs and a bunch of drone attacks. So basically high-tech rocket launchers and tiny little planes. This is really kind of the biggest military hardware that they've pulled out so far, and they have a lot in reserve, much like Russia. So the trend is starting now on the ground that Ukraine is starting to use this military hardware that they've been holding back through this conflict as they are closed in, so that they don't have to overextend themselves and project themselves out onto the countryside the way Russian forces have to. They can keep their military power tight within their cities, and it's really quite impressive that despite all the shelling due to the intel that Ukraine is getting from NATO countries, they've been pretty effective in being able to move the big military hardware around without having to bring it into play. So while a lot of people are pushing this idea that Russia is a big country that could stage up more military, as I discussed before, these reinforcements likely aren't coming soon, and right now Ukraine is poised to make a huge comeback, at least potentially. And they've been kind of waiting for the Russian forces to fall into this trap, where there's no resources coming in and they're stranded. They're stuck well away from their supply lines in the mud, and because all of a sudden they have come into range of the city's defenses, and I hope this goes well, because they have all the potential in the world to really decisively turn this around in this moment, even with what they have had to put up with on the ground. I also think it's important to note that because most of the combatants that we're seeing here are the pre-staged troops that were put on the border prior to the invasion starting, that really our sanctions haven't had really any ability to affect the Russian military yet, even while their effects on the Russian economy have been, pretty devastating in some ways. Just because Russia failed in their objectives so quickly, and I think this is definitely an optimistic view, and I wouldn't be a responsible content creator if I said that this was the likely scenario, but I think that we're seeing the silver lining. I think that we're starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel, and I don't think that necessarily Ukraine needs a decisive utter defeat of Russian forces to win this. I think they just have to do well enough to really scare Russia, and then the negotiations will get a lot more interesting, as Ukraine will have a lot more power on its side, and can say, if you want any of these troops to make it out of my country alive, you drop most of your demands right now. If not even negotiating towards getting Crimea back. He could have that kind of power, and I think another important part to put in here is an agreement or kind of a pact between these countries that could enable him by saying that, we will drop at least a certain amount, if not all of our sanctions against Russia, the moment that they are willing to come to the peace table, which effectively puts a really big trump card on Zelensky's side in these discussions. Because right now there isn't really any assurance that even if a negotiation was met tomorrow, that necessarily the sanctions against Russia would end. And I think that a lot of these are likely to be long-term kind of punitive sanctions. And I think that, some businesses might actually decide, we're going to avoid supporting Russian companies in the future. I think there is kind of a sea change that is happening that won't go away even if this is fully resolved that way. But if you could lessen a lot of the sanctions, allow companies to still boycott Russia if they want, but take the official reasoning behind them currently not doing business with Russia away. Again, I think that could be a huge bargaining chip for Zelensky in this. And at the end of the first month, we are finally getting very close, it feels like, to some sort of diplomatic resolution. the demands on the Russian side have been decreasing, and Ukrainians seem more and more confident that they're going to be able to potentially scale things back enough that they can have an agreeable outcome, maybe even just with the assurance that Ukraine won't enter UN or NATO, while at the same time not stopping them from joining other unions. Though whether or not they will get back the areas of the Donbass or Crimea that have been declared independent through this and through the last decade of warfare, that remains to be seen. I think they'd really have to kick Russia's ass to do that. I think Putin would probably pull out and say that he had claimed one of his objectives before facing the kind of defeat that that would lead to. But I think that Ukraine does potentially have the ability to really kick their asses militarily in a way that could win them some of their freedoms back in this negotiation. It's also worth saying that all of this sounds very positive. It's still an uphill fight. Russia could still do things to change this, maybe overnight, maybe within a few weeks. Like, they could make the long-term war really bad, and they could keep escalating civilian casualties to the point where any good leader would say, I don't want more and more of my people to die, even if I have to concede politically on a few points. Tensions are running high on both sides, so this is going to be a really interesting negotiation. I think that, diplomatically speaking, looking for a diplomatic solution to this, countries should try to give Zelensky as much power by saying, we will go along with X that you agree to, and basically kind of, I don't know, I think we should be at the negotiating table too, in a way, kind of balancing the scales a little bit and giving Zelensky more power to ask for reduced Russian demands, but I'm not really sure that we're doing this. And for the most part, other than for the moment it seems The Intercept, no one is really asking this question. Everyone else is asking when we'll start the no-fly zone and how quickly we can get into World War III. Another thing that I will say that the media has also been kind of overhyping is the Russian protests. While the protesters are incredibly brave, as it looks like they're facing a potential of 15 years in prison for just saying no to war publicly, they are big, but they aren't as big as some even recent Russian protests have been. And it seems like, and polling is difficult, right? Don't get me wrong, polling is difficult. But it seems like most Russians, from what we can tell, support the war. Now, does that mean they support what's actually happening on the ground? No. They support what they think their government is doing. Much like in the same way that we've been polling Americans for about a month now, and we have consistently been saying that we were in support of starting a no-fly zone. However, anytime that you ask that question by saying, would you support a no-fly zone if it meant escalation of war, or, kind of direct military engagement, people say no. And that's exactly what a no-fly zone is, unless both sides are bluffing. But I think there's a high likelihood of someone calling that bluff on one side or another. And in this case, Americans almost like 2-1 disagree with joining the war. Whereas if you just ask them about no-fly zone, it's kind of 2-1 in favor of it. There is also kind of a fear within Russia based on these laws that, and a suspicion, what if I say that I'm against the war in this poll, and it's just the Russian intelligence trying to figure out who doesn't support this? What if someone shows up at my door? And kind of on that note, the way that we are pushing, let's say, like Russian athletes, Russian celebrities, anyone who interfaces outside of Russia with the public, we're kind of forcing them to denounce the war. That's well-intentioned, but as Russian citizens, that puts them in a really dangerous place. And I think we should be a little bit more sympathetic to that before we necessarily cancel individual Russians that aren't a part of the war because they won't speak out on it. I think that, to a certain degree, some of that support for war may come from fear. But at the same time, it would be totally ignorant to pretend as though there is not a nationalist sentiment within Russia, within the Russian public, that supports the idea of anything that would give Russia more geopolitical power or kind of raise their geopolitical power back to what it was in the Soviet era without necessarily embracing all the other aspects of the Soviet era. And I think that there are a lot of Russians who see this, who would even probably wholeheartedly support an actual on-the-ground invasion and annexation of Ukraine to this end. But it's really hard to say how high any of these segments of the Russian population are, because we're about 3 iron curtains of propaganda away from direct contact with the needs and wants and desires of the Russian populace. But I just do want to point out that despite there being massive protests, this does not necessarily mean that the majority of Russians are against the war, that we should expect some sort of a Russian revolution in the streets. One thing that hasn't been a feature of this war is the large-scale cyber attacks like Ukraine has faced for years that have shut down any number of utilities for a number of days in the past. One attack breaking an estimated of 10% of all computers in Ukraine. However, this is another area that global support, especially from the US, has caused Ukraine to become much more competent in. At this point, Ukraine even exports its cybersecurity capabilities, which would tell us why Russian forces are finding it necessary to capture the Ukrainian nuclear plant and other pieces of key infrastructure instead of just taking it down remotely using cyber warfare. The Foxblade malware deployed on day 1 seems to have utterly failed, while at the same time, Ukrainians have succeeded in hacking Russia's Netflix alternative to briefly show on-the-ground fighting in Ukraine to counter Russia propaganda efforts, along with several other small-scale attacks on Russian digital infrastructure. It's a little bit closer to 4 weeks in, by the way, as I'm recording this, and within the last week, we have actually seen Russia hacking a few Ukrainian television networks in order to show really hastily deep-faked footage of fake Zelensky surrendering to Russia and advising Ukrainian citizens to surrender themselves. And it seems like it's just so sloppy that most people won't believe it. But maybe maybe it wasn't meant for all people. Maybe it was meant to just knock away a few percentage points of the resistance. You know what I mean? And maybe it will be effective in that. We saw how damaging this strategy had been for many years in a row as Russia targeted Ukrainian power infrastructure in the dead of winter. But it seems that after the 2017 NotPetya ransomware attack spilled out of Ukrainian borders and caused a total of $10 billion in damage to the world economy, that the world's tech experts decided that Ukraine needed real help in the cyber warfare they were facing. This attack also brought condemnation from abroad as the war splashed over its borders, and in the end even affected Russian businesses. Trump's press secretary, Sarah Sanders, announced that this was, quote, a part of the Kremlin's ongoing effort to destabilize Ukraine, and this demonstrates more clearly than ever Russia's involvement in the ongoing conflict, here referencing the ongoing invasion in the Donbass. She added that this was also a reckless and indiscriminate cyber attack that will be met with international consequences. The UK's Lord Maud was even more direct on this matter. The UK government judges that the Russian government, specifically the Russian military, was responsible for the destructive NotPetya cyber attack of June 2017. The Kremlin has poised Russia in direct opposition to the West. Yet, it doesn't have to be this way. We call upon Russia to be the responsible member of the international community it claims to be, rather than secretly trying to undermine it. We are committed to strengthening coordinated international efforts to uphold a free, open, peaceful, and secure cyberspace. After 5 years of focus on cyber defense later, and Russia's attacks seem to be considerably less dangerous, the most effective cyber weapon of the moment being humble DDoS attacks. Dr. Lennart Maschmeyer of the Center for Security Studies at the Swiss University ETH Zurich says Russia's cyber strategy so far seems more improvised. A plausible scenario for devastating cyber attacks was that Russia had planned this invasion for a long time and pre-positioned implants across Ukraine's critical infrastructure in order to cause mass disruptions, coinciding with the military invasion. That does not seem to be the case, though. The cyber operations that we have seen do not show long preparation, and instead look rather haphazard. This once again reminds us of the real likelihood that this was a rushed invasion because a scared Putin got spooked and went in at exactly the wrong time. But what is important to keep in mind with state cyber warfare is that even if a new type of attack or new type of malware is successfully deflected or nullified by Ukrainian cyber defenses, that new method of attack, that new way of exploiting a system now exists out there somewhere. And people will find it, and within years we will probably be seeing the exact type of, or modified types of the type of cyber warfare platforms that both the US, Ukraine, and Russia are using right now, more commonly sold among hackers on the black market, and therefore making everyone less safe from a cybersecurity perspective. And this is really the problem with state-level cyber warfare in general, in that much like the creation of the nuclear bomb, every time we create a new massively powerful cyber warfare technique that can bypass even a country with advanced cyber defenses, then your average computer user, or even most American companies who might have your data, get lost in that arms race very quickly, and it creates openings where our data is vulnerable. Even if our personal security practices are good, the companies that we allow to have our data, their practices might not be as good. So even though this seems to be the little cyber war that didn't, it will have drastic cybersecurity ramifications in the long term that will ripple out. I think that a lot of the Ukrainian efforts by way of propaganda or journalism, or even this idea that, like, when they capture Russian soldiers, they've been making their mommies come from Russia to pick them up. And I think that's awesome. That's incredible. It's like, you're never going to get any more shit. Like, can you imagine how embarrassing that would be just for one? You know, like, your mother is going to give you so much shit if she has to come pick you up from the front lines. And also, imagine all of those angry Russian women trying to navigate these convoys, and just all of the bullshit coming into Russia to pick up their children. That's just going to bog this down so much more. Like, I don't think many people are actually going to do it. I think it's more of a propaganda stunt, but it's just hilarious to think about, right? And it's certainly good news that what appears to be a large gulf between the two countries in terms of strategy and logistics is helping Ukrainians on the ground. It's still not entirely good news at the moment. A little over 2 weeks into the invasion, we were already seeing that Russian forces are largely stalled, but continuing to push forward. They haven't made any real large successes on the ground, and they've even been pushed out of at least one city that they'd held. However, they continue to shore up their troops, and more Russian soldiers are entering the country every day, as well as their military equipment pouring in from rail lines just over the border. And so the Russian advance seemed to be summed up best as one step forward and two steps back. But eventually, over time, they will be able to overcome some of their logistical hurdles through better planning and preparations for the actual situation that they're facing on the ground. The military convoy will eventually advance, and it will eventually reach its destination, and perhaps to make up for their numerous failures on the ground and the way that Putin is being made a fool of, has stepped up Putin's intents to bomb parts of Ukraine to the ground.
I believe the Russians had a shock and awe campaign planned, that they would rush in, get down to Kiev quickly, depose Zelensky, put in their own puppet regime, and then let the Ukrainians accept that as a fait accompli and move on. What they found out is quite the opposite. The problem with the Russians is not their equipment, it's their tactics. Even though they came from a huge training operation in Belarus, I didn't see them maneuvering the way a well-trained army would.
And this sees him committing many war crimes. And it's not that there weren't war crimes here to begin with. As you can see on repurposed signs throughout Ukraine, all paths in Ukraine lead to The Hague for Russian forces.
Russian strategy, unfortunately, is working well as they shell the cities. You can see the massive destruction being taken inside the cities, the bombing of the protected sites, shooting the maternity ward, using rockets and artillery well before they use a whole lot of troops, classic Russian tactics.
Tonight, the humanitarian crisis only getting worse. The United Nations saying a staggering 10 million Ukrainians have either fled the country or have been displaced internally. Half said to be children.
After 2 weeks of logistical invasion failures, remember that as people often invoke this parallel to Afghanistan, like when Russia invaded Afghanistan, they killed the target of the country in 3 days. And judging by how quickly they ran through their supplies in this invasion, it seems that despite the weather, Putin had expected to do something very similar here. As I said in my previous video, he expected to have Kyiv and the major cities around Ukraine encircled by his forces within 2 weeks. And that still hasn't happened 4 weeks in at this point. Although, he is inching closer to accomplishing this every day. One of the big stories happening about 2 weeks ago was Mariupol, where Russia has agreed to create civilian evacuation quarters in order to reduce civilian casualties. However, as an Al Jazeera journalist who got behind the lines of Mariupol soon discovered and showed the world, Russia seemed to be specifically bombing these civilian corridors in what had agreed to be a ceasefire, which mirrors their tactics since the Minsk agreement in their first invasion of Ukraine, where the firing never really stopped for very long.
The largest and deadliest strike yet on the capital. Kyiv has been rocked by massive explosions, images emerging today of the size of the blast. Video verified by ABC News shows the moment the missile hit a shopping mall on the edge of Kyiv, killing at least 8 people. As dawn broke, the sheer scale of the aftermath was revealed. Rescuers searching for survivors, pulling victims from the rubble. Residents nearby were left bewildered, searching for belongings in bombed-out buildings. The Russian military releasing this astonishing video they say is of the attack. And tonight, rescuers searching for survivors in the rubble of an art school in the besieged city of Mariupol after Russian forces attacked. Hundreds believed to be trapped. Ukrainians in the key port city defiantly rejecting Russian demands to surrender. The death toll soaring. Residents forced to bury the dead in the shadows of destroyed buildings. The Ukrainian Foreign Ministry now accusing the Russians of forcibly deporting thousands of city residents, including children, to parts of Russia. The US says it's investigating. In Kherson, the shocking images of Russians firing on a crowd of protesters. Verified video circulating online shows the moment Russian forces opened fire on the crowd, firing stun grenades to try to break up the peaceful protest. At least 4 reportedly injured, 1 with a bullet wound.
Except that this seems to be intentionally employed not only to target civilians, but also to concentrate them into specific locations to be targeted and picked off by Russian artillery. Increasingly, we're seeing Russia's efforts to bomb cities to the ground. In order to flatten the resistance there, we see increasing Russian efforts to cut off civilian populations from water, food, and power, as well as various other necessities. And maybe it's just because the world is only paying attention now to this in a way that we perhaps haven't paid attention to the tactics of similar crises that invoked a number of war crimes themselves. But what is being done here against these people is so utterly foul, and it's such a cowardly technique for a stronger opponent to militarily take. And I think that shows a certain weakness that might be present within Russia at the moment, or at least I can hope. It feels like Russia is rushing this, and has been from the very beginning. It also seems like China isn't as willing to back Putin economically as he'd hope, and as we see economic and military plans simultaneously failing, Putin is facing massive and continuous protest, tanking poll numbers, and more Russian people beginning to decry the war in spite of serious crackdowns on anti-war media and protest, which could lead now to up to 15 years behind bars. Could it be that Putin fears he is losing his grip, his control over the country? We can see this beginning to fail within his own oligarchy, many of which are starting to speak out against him in some way. We see Russian solidarity failing in Belarus, we're also seeing what seems to be an unprecedented amount of solidarity, at least between the people of the former Soviet states, as civilians from these countries continue to pour in to supplement Ukraine's self-defense forces, mainly through the Polish border. None of this is an outcome that anyone necessarily would have expected, although in some ways it is an outcome that I had hoped would come to pass. And let's hope that even while these war crimes persist and increase in frequency, let's hope that this is the moment where Putin's back is to the wall. As a part of this discussion, it's worth reiterating a point that I made earlier. Russian propaganda is often repurposed from America's talking points in propaganda. To this end, as they're writing this, they're simultaneously shutting people out of the public internet and at the same time rebroadcasting Tucker Carlson with Russian subtitles. And that is not actually even a metaphor. As I previously mentioned, Russian excuses for civilian casualties are basically exactly what the US state had said regarding our own warfare in Iraq, and a recent strain of Russian propaganda about biological weapons, funded by the US, existing in Ukraine, seems to take its lead from the lab leak theory, although this time seemingly with little basis in reality. However, this is a troubling sign because it follows in a previous Russian strategy that aided propaganda efforts that led up to the invasion. And this is Russia pushing a fake narrative and then using false flag operations to support their propaganda, as I noted in a previous episode. Given other escalations and war crime committed, could this indicate a coming Russian biological attack? And in face of such a thing, who will continue to remain neutral? Let's hope that the atrocities that we have seen already are the tactical last gasp of the Russian Empire, or at least this iteration of it. And let's hope that if things do fall apart here as they have in the past, let's hope that this iteration of the crisis, someone lends Russia an olive branch. This is a country that could potentially be a powerful ally, and has been a powerful enemy. And I think we're moving into a world that is increasingly globalized and interconnected, where there isn't as much of a place for countries to have enemies anymore. And I think that hopefully this is a sign that will usher in a new geopolitical age of peace, cooperation, and expansion of allyship, and solidarity through nations, both locally and global, instead of the corporate globalization that we saw in the 1990s. Let us instead cooperate, not to ship things all over the world to exploit labor as effectively as possible, but instead use our cooperation to build each other's countries up, and our populations up, reducing inequality and poverty, but building the world into something greater than it currently is. And one step towards really finding ourselves in that world after the dust clears, we actually need to hold accountable those who push for war crimes, those who ordered them to be done, to send a message to the rest of the world that this is an age of government-sponsored terrorism is finally coming to an end, and it will no longer be tolerated. Only then can we move forward to a politics of peace. However, it's important to note that none of this is much solace to Ukrainian civilians now. Of the two major bodies that prosecute war crimes in some way, you have the UN Security Council, on which Russia has a veto vote, and the ICC, which neither Russia or Ukraine is a party to. Ukraine did, however, give the ICC permission to investigate war crimes within its borders during the first Russian invasion, and nothing has come of this so far. And this is partially because to enforce such rulings would require military force, but more importantly, the political will to fight Russia directly, which none of the world's governments seems to possess, Ukraine excluded. That said, should there be regime change in Russia, it might be the case that Putin and his compatriots in this right might be held accountable at a later date. However, this has little bearing on what is happening now, and Putin has been clear in his actions. War crimes just aren't going to stop him.
They certainly are not moving anywhere as quickly as they had planned. The reason, twofold. Number one, they've been sloppy, they've been ill-disciplined, they've lost their supplies, they've run out of food. And then the second reason, of course, is the stiff, tough resistance that has been shown by the Ukrainian forces, all the way from the professional military down to the territorial forces.
Будемо займатися зачисткою одного із сіл, в якому зараз знаходяться орки з броньованою технікою. По даним розвідки, до батальйону.
They were moving properly the way that you move to an ambush site. They seem to be well disciplined. They seem to be in the correct formations as they move forward. They obviously got hit by probably a guard unit that was protecting the tanks, and that's where you could hear the fire coming in from the Russian side. They were talking to their higher headquarters on either their cell phones or their radios. The higher headquarters probably told them to withdraw. Withdrawing under fire is a very difficult task, but they seem to do it quite well. This unit was obviously well trained. They did it exactly by the book.
Now that I've given you all of the concepts, now that you can fully understand the situation, finally wanted to show you a bit of the take that I actually wanted to make. Ukraine has been a country for less than 100 years, and in the life cycle of a nation, is still taking their first steps into independence. Only in 1991, 31 years ago, taking the first steps into true independence. 31 years of fire in the Ukrainian soul over the last century. The history of Ukraine has been an aggressive fight against Russian soft power and civil servants given orders by the president to shoot on sight. They fought long and hard time and again for their independence, and every time that they've gotten it, they ask for more and more. They get a name, statehood, then they become an independent country that's still controlled by Russia's sphere of influence and soft power. It was once a nation held by oligarchy and corruption, and then decades following their independence, they fight back against even that. They fight back against the idea of their future should be tied so closely to Russia, when Russia seems to have no interest in seeing them thriving and independent. And the last 8 years, militias have fought along the front lines in Ukraine. Civilian territories have suffered intermittent shelling and ceasefire pretty much since the nation began, but it is not stopping them. I look forward to the future with the brightest hope of what Ukraine might become in 10, 20, or even 30 years. I am already so proud of what they are. Proud of the zeal by which they defend the independence they have fought for the last 31 years. And I am inspired by the way that even the citizens of Ukraine will not let those 30 years be in vain now. And I have been blessed to be able to share with you this beautiful story and the beautiful future that I dream of. It may not happen, but I think that if there is any hero that can summon the strength it takes to mount obstacles that first seem insurmountable, to defend itself against Russia and somehow come out of it stronger and more united with its surrounding countries and with its own citizens than it ever was before, I think perhaps Ukraine might be that nation. They hope, I hope, that years of invasion and fighting for independence doesn't sour them and their culture in the way that we saw in Afghanistan. Because I have seen a change in Ukraine even in my lifetime. If you want an inspiring story, I inspire you to watch either of my videos on Euromaidan. It was in writing and researching the first of those videos that I first felt that I could relate to them. You know, having a huge protest movement for the independence of my country, having just come out of Occupy years before, and we were never shot out in the streets. I mean, for the most part, Occupy wasn't even treated as brutally by the police as something like Black Lives Matter has been, as many modern protests have been. Like, I've watched protests get more brutal over my lifetime, and still, I can't imagine what Ukrainians face towards the end of Euromaidan, and if that was happening here, I can't imagine the bravery I would have to summon to stand up to those police who have told that it is perfectly acceptable to murder us. even if you would say within Black Lives Matter that this is kind of implied in policing, especially if you happen to have a certain skin color that doesn't look quite like this, even today, I can see where you're coming from there. But it's not like your president was literally saying to the police, I don't care if you have to kill them, get them out of Maidan Square. I can't imagine that scenario, and again, the courage shown by Ukrainians who continue to fight for their rights in that moment, that is astounding. And it's the same type of courage that they will need to retain their independence and their goodwill on their part. I hope that Ukraine can forgive us for not setting up no-fly zones and not putting boots on the ground. I'm sure that we would all feel differently if this was our country and not one that maybe some of us are just now really hearing about. And a big part of the reason that we don't, our own self-interest, we don't want to jump in this fight because we might get hurt. No one wants to poke the nuclear bear. But again, I'm sure we would all feel differently if this was our country. So to Ukraine, I know that you have the spirit. I know that you have the courage. I know that it means enough to you that you will put your heart into defending your country, and I wish you the best. I hope that our countries can find more and more ways to support you. And I hope that we find more and more diplomatic ways to support you. I hope that this can end soon without you having to concede your territory. I'm hoping that these things that we're doing to apply pressure, that Ukraine needs to stay safe and come to a victory in this conflict. And I'd like to end this series with 3 important words. Glory to Ukraine.